Right now, somewhere on this planet, you're lying in bed, maybe with the lights off, maybe with this video playing softly in the background, waiting for sleep to come. But have you ever wondered what it actually took to get to this point? Not just for you tonight, but for every single human who ever lived before alarm clocks, before light bulbs, before mattresses and blackout curtains existed. What did a caveman do at 2 in the afternoon that made him fall asleep hard by nightfall? What did an early farmer's body go through between sunrise and sunset that determined whether she slept soundly or tossed and turned? These aren't small questions. They're actually some of the most fascinating puzzles in human history, and almost nobody talks about them. See, we obsess over sleep today. We buy sleep trackers, we take melatonin, we argue about whether 8 hours is really necessary. But we rarely ask the deeper question. Sleep doesn't happen in isolation. It's the end result of an entire day. What you did, how hard you worked when you ate, how much light hit your eyes, whether you were scared or safe, whether your community was resting around you or still moving. Ancient humans didn't have sleep hygiene routines. They didn't need them. Their entire day was, in a sense, one long preparation for the night. And here's where things get genuinely surprising. There's real evidence from anthropology, from sleep labs studying modern hunter-gatherer groups, from archaeology that ancient sleep might have looked nothing like yours. Some researchers think early humans may have slept in 2 separate chunks, with an hour or more of quiet wakefulness in the middle of the night. Others suggest sleep timing shifted dramatically with the seasons, stretching long in winter, compressing short in summer, following the sun almost like a tide. There's even evidence that some communities took their most important rest, not at night at all, but in the punishing heat of midday, when working outside would have been dangerous, even deadly. Now, before you assume we have this all figured out, I want to be honest with you. A lot of what we know about ancient sleep is inference. Educated guesswork built from fragments. We don't have footage of a Paleolithic campsite at 3 in the morning. Nobody was writing diary entries 100,000 years ago. What we do have is a patchwork of clues, skeletal remains that show wear patterns from certain sleeping positions, charcoal and ash layers that hint at how fires were maintained through the night. Studies of modern foraging societies, like the Hadza in Tanzania or the San in southern Africa, who still live without electric light, and give us a rare living window into what unmedicated, unscheduled sleep might look like, and comparisons with our closest primate relatives, whose sleep patterns can hint at what's biologically ancient versus what's culturally invented. None of this gives us certainty. All of it gives us possibility. And honestly, that's what makes this journey so compelling. We're not here to hand you a textbook. We're here to walk through the evidence together and let the mystery breathe a little. Before we go further, I'd genuinely love to know where you're listening from and what time it is right there for you. I check the comments constantly, and it's wild to picture Tokyo just past midnight, Chicago right at dinner, London somewhere in between, all listening to the same story about how humans used to fall asleep. Drop it below, so here's what's coming. We're going to walk through an ordinary ancient day, morning to night, forager to farmer, campfire to quiet dark, and piece together what daily life actually did to prepare the body and mind for rest. No modern lifestyle lectures, no forcing you to eat like a caveman or ditch your phone. Just the strange, layered, deeply human story of how our ancestors earned their sleep every single day of their lives. So let's actually answer the question you're probably already asking. How do we know any of this? Nobody handed archaeologists a sleep diary from 50,000 years ago. There's no cave painting labelled me, struggling to fall asleep, Tuesday. So where does this information actually come from? And more importantly, how confident should we really be in it? The answer starts underground, literally with archaeology. When researchers excavate ancient campsites and settlements, they're not just looking for arrowheads and pottery. They're looking for hearths, the remains of fires that burned night after night for generations. A hearth isn't just a pile of ash, it's a clock. The way charcoal layers build up, the way soot stains the walls of a cave, the way burned material shifts in density and composition. All of it can suggest how long a fire burned, how often it was rekindled, and sometimes even whether it was tended through the night or allowed to die down. Some archaeological sites show evidence of fires maintained continuously for what looks like extended periods, hinting that someone, maybe several someones on rotation, was staying awake to keep the flames alive while others slept. Then there's the dwellings themselves, post holes, packed earth floors, arrangements of stones. These tell us where people slept relative to where they cooked, where they worked, where they stored food. Some sites show clear activity zones, a food preparation area here, a tool-making area there, and a slightly separated space with different soil compaction that might indicate where bedding once existed. Organic material like grass, leaves, or animal hides doesn't survive tens of thousands of years in most conditions, so we rarely find actual beds. But we sometimes find the impression they left behind, a patterned depression in ancient sediment, a chemical signature in the soil that suggests decomposed plant bedding. At a site called Sibudu Cave in South Africa, archaeologists found layered plant bedding dating back over 70,000 years, complete with what looks like insect-repelling leaves mixed in. That's not just evidence of sleep. That's evidence of people actively engineering a better night's rest. But bones and dirt only tell part of the story. This is where bioarchaeology comes in, the study of human remains themselves. And honestly, this is where things get almost uncomfortably personal. Teeth, for instance, are incredible time capsules. The wear patterns on ancient teeth can reveal diet, but they can also reveal stress, chronic grinding, malnutrition, even repetitive tasks, like using teeth as tools. Bones tell similar stories. Stress markers, small lines and irregularities in bone growth called Harris lines, can indicate periods of illness or nutritional deprivation during childhood. Repetitive strain patterns on joints and vertebrae can suggest the kind of relentless physical labour that would leave a body exhausted by nightfall, whether that's a forager who walked 10 miles a day or a farmer who spent a decade bent over the same field. Even parasites leave a paper trail. Preserved fecal matter called coprolites sometimes contains the eggs of intestinal worms and other parasites that would have caused chronic discomfort, itching, and disrupted rest. Lice have been found in the hair of naturally preserved bodies. Imagine trying to sleep soundly with an active lice infestation, and no shampoo, no fine-tooth combs, nothing but scratching and irritation, until exhaustion finally won. These aren't romantic details, but they're honest ones, and they matter enormously if we're trying to understand what actually kept ancient humans up at night, sometimes literally. Now, archaeology and bioarchaeology give us physical evidence, but they can't tell us everything. They can't tell us what people were thinking, whether they feared the dark, whether they told stories by the fire before drifting off, whether children were rocked to sleep or left to cry it out 10,000 years before that phrase existed. For that kind of texture, researchers turn to ethnography, the study of living human cultures, especially societies that still practice foraging lifestyles similar in some ways to our deep ancestors. Groups like the Hadza of Tanzania or the San of the Kalahari have been studied extensively, partly because their lack of electric lighting and industrial schedules offers a rare living window into sleep patterns that aren't dictated by clocks or artificial light. But here's the caution, and it's a big one. These modern groups are not time capsules. They are not frozen relics of the Paleolithic, walking around unchanged for 100,000 years. They live in the present, They have contact with modern technology, modern medicine, modern neighbours. Their environments, social structures and histories are unique to them, shaped by their own particular pressures and adaptations. When a study finds that the HUDs sleep an average of 6 to 7 hours a night without obvious signs of chronic sleep deprivation, that's genuinely useful data. It challenges the assumption that 8 hours is some universal biological requirement. But it would be a mistake to assume every ancient human group slept exactly like the HUDs do today. They're a window, not a mirror, a hint, not a certainty. Then there's the written record, though this only becomes available much later in human history, and even then unevenly. Once societies developed writing, we start getting direct testimony. Religious texts describing prayer schedules tied to specific hours of night. Legal codes regulating nighttime behaviour, curfews, restrictions on movement after dark, rules about who was allowed to be awake and doing what. Personal diaries, though rare and usually limited to literate elites, occasionally mention sleep directly. Complaints about restless nights, descriptions of waking in darkness to pray or work, references to naps taken during oppressive afternoon heat. Art, too, offers glimpses, paintings and carvings depicting people resting, sleeping figures in domestic scenes, occasionally even scenes suggesting dreams or nighttime rituals. But here's the catch, and it's worth sitting with for a second. All of this evidence, all of it comes with a built-in bias. Archaeology preserves durable materials in specific conditions: dry caves, waterlogged bogs, volcanic ash. Most human activity, especially the mundane, everyday stuff, simply doesn't survive. We're far more likely to find evidence of exceptional events, a dramatic burial, a catastrophic fire, a site abandoned suddenly, than we are to find traces of an ordinary Tuesday night 10,000 years ago. Written records skew even harder toward elites. The literate, the wealthy, the powerful, the people whose lives were considered worth recording. The vast majority of ancient humans left no written trace of their existence at all, let alone their sleep habits. So when we piece together what ancient sleep might have looked like, we're essentially assembling a mosaic from fragments, some fragments large and detailed, others tiny and ambiguous, with huge gaps in between that we fill in with careful, informed speculation. It's not guesswork in the reckless sense. It's inference built on convergent evidence, archaeology lining up with bioarchaeology, ethnography lining up with what little textual evidence exists. But it's also not certainty, and keeping that honesty front and centre is going to matter a lot as we move deeper into this story, because some of what's coming next sounds almost too strange to be true. Which is exactly why we need to understand, before anything else, just how fragile and fascinating the evidence really is. If you strip away the gaps in the archaeological record, if you ignore for a moment the fact that we don't have anybody's Stone Age sleep diary, there's still one massive obvious clue about how people's days were structured. The sky before alarm clocks, before shift schedules, before blue LEDs and blackout curtains, the single most powerful force shaping human sleep was the pattern of light and dark. Not just day versus night, but the specific kind of light your eyes get at different times. And this is one of those rare places where modern lab science and deep human history line up almost perfectly. Your brain has a master clock. It lives in a little cluster of neurons called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, tucked right above where your optic nerves cross. It doesn't care what your phone says, or what your boss says, or what your to-do list says. Its main input is one thing: light, especially morning light. Not all light is equal here. Dawn light has a very particular signature. The sun is low on the horizon, the light is less intense than midday, but rich in short wavelengths, what we casually call blue light. Specialized cells in your retina are tuned to that pattern. They send a very blunt message to your brain. Day has started. Reset now. When chronobiologists take modern humans, stick them in a forest or a desert with no artificial lights, and tell them to live like campers for a few weeks, something predictable happens. Bedtimes start drifting earlier. Wake times start clustering just after sunrise. The internal circadian day length, which in humans is often slightly longer than 24 hours in isolation, gets locked or entrained to the external 24-hour cycle by that morning light. In other words, your body, left to its own devices in a natural environment, synchronizes itself to dawn. Now imagine not a camping trip, but a lifetime. Imagine being outside for hours every single day, in direct daylight orders of magnitude brighter than the indoor lighting most of us live under now. An overcast sky at noon is still 10, 20, 50 times brighter than a well-lit office. A clear sky at midday can be 100 times brighter or more. For ancient foragers, and later for early farmers, that kind of light wasn't a weekend novelty. It was the default. You walked, gathered, hunted, dug, carried, talked, and watched children under wide-open sky. Even if you were in a forest, dappled shade still beats the lumen levels inside most modern homes. Their master clocks were getting hammered with bright light cues day after day. Their circadian rhythms weren't just gently nudged by the sun, they were nailed into place by it. This doesn't mean everyone woke up the instant the first bird chirped and went to bed the second the sun dipped. Humans are flexible. We'll come back to night watch, fire tending, and segmented sleep later. But the baseline, the anchor, was almost certainly first light. Most people's biology was being reset every morning, whether they wanted it to be or not. If dawn was the big start signal, dusk was the big slow down signal. As the sun drops, the spectrum of light shifts again. There's more long wavelength, reddish light, and rapidly decreasing intensity. To your circadian system, the drop in brightness is as important as the sunrise spike. In the lab, dimming the lights early in the evening causes melatonin, the hormone that helps initiate sleep to rise earlier. Keeping lights bright pushes melatonin later. Now put yourself in a world where the evening light dimmed on its own, predictably, every single day. Fires existed, yes. Torches, oil lamps, candles existed later. But they're not 800 lumen LED panels. They're small islands of flickering yellow-orange light that fall off sharply a few meters away. Fuel is labour. Wood has to be gathered, dried, carried. Oils have to be rendered, torches have to be made. In many contexts, keeping a huge blaze roaring all night is expensive, smoky, and dangerous. So dusk for most ancient people was not something you blasted away with a wall switch. It was a transition you moved through. Outdoor work becomes harder. Colours fade, the far horizon disappears. Social focus tightens to whoever is close to the fire or inside the shelter. The environmental message to your brain is simple. Activity window closing. Start shutting things down. That doesn't mean everyone obediently laid down at nautical twilight, but it does mean their bodies were getting a strong, consistent evening signal that most modern urbanites never actually experience. There's another complication: seasons and where on earth you happen to live. We're used to the idea that normal is some fixed bedtime, fixed wake time, 12 months a year. School bells at 8, work at 9. Primetime TV at 7. But that whole idea only makes sense in a world where electric light flattens out the differences between June and December. Without that technology, the length of the day is not a background detail. It's the scaffolding of the year. Near the equator, day length barely budges. 12 hours of light, 12 of dark, give or take an hour. For ancient humans in those latitudes, circadian entrainment was probably remarkably stable across seasons. Dawn comes at roughly the same time. Dusk comes at roughly the same time. You can imagine routines that feel almost monotonously regular over the course of the year, at least as far as light cues go. Move away from the equator, and the whole picture warps. In mid-latitudes, winter days can be brutally short. The sun limps above the horizon late in the morning and drops again in the late afternoon. Summer days can feel endless, with light lingering well into the evening. Go farther poleward, and you get extreme cases, weeks where the sun barely sets or barely rises. Ancient people living in these regions weren't stubbornly maintaining one universal sleep schedule while the sky played tricks on them. Their internal clocks are still biologically tuned to about 24 hours, but the timing of sleep within that 24-hour cycle likely flexed with the seasons far more than most modern people are prepared for. In long winter conditions, night could easily mean 14 or 16 hours of darkness. That doesn't automatically translate to 16 hours of sleep. Humans aren't bears. But it does create a long window where high-energy activity is impractical and risky. It's during these seasons that patterns like segmented sleep, extended twilight conversations, and nocturnal rituals become plausible, because there is simply more darkness to fill. In high summer, the opposite pressure applies. Short nights, early dawns, late sunsets, and an explosion of seasonal resources, migrating animals, ripening plants, pull wakefulness toward the light at both ends. You can imagine people sleeping in shorter, slightly more fragmented blocks, grabbing rest when they can, because the ecological payoff of staying aligned with a long, bright day is enormous. And crucially, there was no single human answer to this. A group in tropical Africa, another in Ice Age Europe, another on a windswept steppe or dense rainforest, are all getting different light signatures across the year. Their circadian clocks are built on the same biology, but the external schedule that biology is locking onto, the rise and fall of light in their particular patch of sky, is different. So, when we talk about what ancient humans did all day for sleep, the first move is to stop imagining a clock and start imagining a horizon. For them, time wasn't a set of numbers on a face. It was a shifting pattern of brightness and colour, of long and short days, of easy dawns and brutal late-rising winter suns. Their sleep didn't float free of that pattern. It was anchored to it, season after season, year after year. So let's zoom in on one of those dawns your ancestors kept getting nailed to. What does waking up even mean in a world with no clocks? No alarms, no blinds, no cars rumbling past at 6:30 every morning. It probably wasn't one single thing. It was a stack of cues layered on top of a biology that was already leaning toward morning. First, the light, not the Instagram sunrise over a mountain ridge. The barely there grey that seeps into a shelter or filters through leaves or glows at the edge of a cave mouth. Even with your eyes closed, your brain can tell. Those same specialized retinal cells that talk to your circadian clock don't need conscious vision. As the sky brightens, melatonin falls. Cortisol creeps up. Your body starts silently shifting from night mode to go mode before you're fully awake. Then, temperature. In many environments, especially away from the tropics, pre-dawn is the coldest point of the 24-hour cycle. Air settles. Ground radiates heat into the sky. If you've ever camped, you know that shiver that hits right before sunrise, even inside a decent sleeping bag. For ancient humans with simple bedding and drafty shelters, that cold was a physical nudge. Staying motionless meant staying cold, moving, huddling closer to others, poking at the embers of last night's fire. That's how you get warm. So even if you weren't consciously choosing to wake up, your body had reasons. Layer on sound. Birds starting their dawn chorus. insects changing their noise profile, grazing animals shifting, predators retreating or, in some ecosystems, doing the opposite. Inside the group, someone always had a reason to be up earlier than the rest. The person tending coals, the nursing mother whose baby stirred, the light sleeper on the edge of camp who reacted to any rustle in the dark. As soon as they moved, everyone else inherited their wake-up call. Footsteps, whispered voices, the scrape of a pot, the crackle of revived fire. Morning didn't arrive like a digital alarm. It seeped in through light, cold, noise, and other people. Once you're awake enough to accept that the night is over, the first jobs of the day were surprisingly sleep-relevant. If your group used fire, and for a huge swath of human history, fire was non-optional, the first priority was checking the coals. Letting a fire go out completely wasn't just annoying. It meant work, hunting for a natural source, begging a coal from a neighbour, or laboriously spinning a drill or striking stones to spark a new one. So someone's morning often began with a small practical act of disaster prevention. Blow gently on the dull orange embers, add dry twigs and kindling, coax a flame back to life. That choice shaped everything that came later. Warmth, cooked food, protection from some predators, control over smoke and insects. In a very literal sense, getting up meant making sure your group still had the technology that made a predictable sleep period possible. Water was another early morning anchor. Springs, rivers, and wells don't move to you. You move to them. In many traditional societies we can still observe first light trips to fetch water are routine. It makes sense. You want water before the day heats up, before animals churn up the banks, before you need it for cooking. So one of the first tasks after leaving whatever counted as your bed was walking, lifting, carrying, quiet, repetitive work that doubled as a kind of physical warm-up. Tools came next, for foragers, that might have meant checking spear points, reteeing bindings, scraping a hide, making sure baskets weren't unravelling. For early farmers it meant inspecting digging sticks, hoes, or later ploughs and harnesses. Morning was when you discover that the cord frayed yesterday, or the stone flake chipped in the wrong place, or the basket rats chewed through in the night. Fix it now and the day runs smoothly. Ignore it, and you're doing emergency repairs under a blazing sun, or at a moment when you really should be paying attention to a herd of nervous animals. Alongside the gear check came body maintenance, not a spa routine, but the kind of baseline hygiene that matters when parasites, infection and injury are constant threats. In a world without hot running water, you wash when it's practical. At the river on the way back from a water run, with a bit of stored water and ash, with damp moss or sand as an abrasive. Faces, hands, maybe feet. In colder climates, maybe only the parts that really need it that day. In warmer ones, more extensive rinsing is likely. Hair gets combed with fingers or bone combs where those existed. Lice and other parasites, which were basically ubiquitous, get picked off. This isn't speculation. Combs from ancient settlements, from Roman towns to medieval villages, are packed with fossilized nits. Ethnographic accounts from recent centuries show people casually grooming and delousing each other in the quiet parts of the day. Morning, when everyone is in one place, and not yet scattered to hunt or weed or travel, is a perfect time. These small acts, washing grit from a cut, rewrapping a bandage, stretching stiff joints, had real consequences for sleep. A wound tended early is less likely to throb all night. An itch calmed, a splinter removed, a bite soothed, each lowers the odds that you'll be yanked out of rest later. But maybe the most underrated part of ancient mornings was what happened between tasks, talking. When everyone is still gathered and not yet swallowed by distance, noise and effort, you have a window for coordination. This is when "what are we doing today?" actually gets decided. Which direction will the hunters go given what they saw yesterday? Who's joining which group? Is someone staying back with a sick child or an injured elder? Are you going to check the berry patch to the east or return to the shellfish bed on the coast? For farmers, it's which field gets priority before the heat sets in. Are we weeding, sowing, harvesting, repairing fences, digging irrigation channels? You can imagine people sharing information, where the tracks were freshest, where strangers' smoke was spotted, where the last storm knocked down trees. It doesn't have to be a formal council. It's gossip plus logistics, braided together while someone pokes the fire and someone else braids a cord and a child asks annoying questions. That planning isn't just about food and safety, it feeds directly back into sleep. A group with a coherent morning plan is less likely to be scrambling at dusk, still far from shelter or still processing food by firelight when they ought to be winding down. Early clarity buys late calm, and in that sense early morning may have been the closest thing ancient people had to what productivity gurus now call deep work time. Light is bright enough to see, but still soft. The air is cool. Insects, where they're a problem, may be less active. Predators are either settling after a night's hunt or not yet ramped up for crepuscular activity. Children might still be groggy, tucked near elders. The village, the camp, the cave is awake but not yet loud. It's the hour when you can fletch arrows without interruption, repair a net with full attention, tell a coherent story about yesterday's near miss with a boar so that younger hunters actually learn something from it. It's when decisions can be made calmly rather than under pressure. For most of human history, the morning probably wasn't a frantic sprint out the door. It was a short, dense stretch of low to medium effort tasks. Revive the fire, fetch water, fix the tools, wash the body, plan the day, that quietly set the trajectory of everything that followed, including how smoothly people would be able to return to sleep when darkness rolled back in. Once the talking and tool checking is done, the day stretches outward. For foragers, that stretch is mostly made of 4 verbs: walk, scan, gather, carry. It's tempting to imagine hunting and gathering as a constant, intense activity, like an all-day workout, where everyone is sprinting after antelope or stripping trees bare. The reality, as far as we can tell from modern hunter-gatherers, and the archaeological scraps they leave behind, is more stuttered. Bursts of effort wrapped in a lot of moving, noticing and deciding. You leave camp, but you don't march in a straight line like a hiking group on a tight schedule. You drift along paths your people know, game trails, riverbanks, ridgelines that give you a good view. Walking is slow enough that you can stop, turn, crouch and backtrack without feeling like you're falling behind, because there is no behind. There's only whether the day's route yields anything useful. Every few steps, someone's eyes flick sideways, a slightly different kind of green that might mean edible leaves. A broken stem that might be from an animal brushing past. The glint of water where you didn't expect it. When anthropologists follow foragers with GPS trackers, the paths look like scribbles, not neat lines. Short cuts, loops, pauses, detours. The rhythm is walk a bit, spot something, decide if it's worth attention, either stop and work on it or keep going. That decision-making is its own form of labour. You're constantly updating a mental map that lives partly in your mind and partly in the group's shared memory. Where the tubers were big last rainy season, where the fruiting trees are, and how many other groups might be visiting them. Where a predator was seen, where a field of wild grains is just shy of ripe, worth checking again in a week. So even when your muscles are doing something simple, step, 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 your brain is running a quiet, non-stop navigation program. You're tracking landmarks, seasonality, wind direction, animal signs, and social information. The people we traded with last dry season claimed that stand of trees, maybe we don't press too far in that direction. There's division of labour in this, but it's not the clock in, clock out kind. In many foraging societies we can still observe, groups split for the day. Some people focus on big game, some on small animals, some on plant foods close to camp, some on distant high-risk patches. Age, skill, and current health matter more than rigid gender categories, although patterns do emerge. Nursing mothers are unlikely to sprint after fleeing animals. Older men might not want to hike steep ridges all day, but they might be the ones who know exactly which ravine has water even in a drought. The key is flexibility. If the hunters come back empty-handed, but the shellfish collectors found a bonanza, nobody stands around saying, "Sorry, I'm not scheduled for clamming until Thursday." People switch tasks over the course of a lifetime, and even over the course of a week. If berries suddenly come ripe in huge quantities, hunting can take a temporary back seat while the whole group turns into a processing crew, because you either exploit the glut now or lose it. Within the day itself, the body's thermostat helps organize effort. In many climates, the coolest hours after dawn and before full mid-morning sun are when the longest walking happens. Cover distance while it's tolerable. As the heat builds, activity changes. The group might move into shaded areas to dig tubers, husk seeds, or process what they've already collected. Short, intense bursts of work are interleaved with spells of sitting, talking, and watching. Thermoregulation isn't abstract. If you overheat badly miles from water and shelter, that's not just unpleasant, that's dangerous. So pacing is survival. The rhythm becomes move when it's cool, slow down when it's hot, use shade and breezes, wet your head and neck if there's water. If you've ever hiked in hot weather and found yourself automatically resting under lone trees or rocks, that's the same basic calculus. And all the while, scanning never really stops. Even at rest you're noticing. Fruit overhead, ant trails that might lead to honey, cloud patterns that hint at afternoon storms, distant dust that might mean animals or other humans. When something worth exploiting appears, the tempo spikes. A tree heavy with ripe figs, a fresh carcass abandoned by a predator. A rabbit flushed from cover. Now the day condenses into concentrated effort, climbing, shaking, shouting, throwing, butchering. Voices get louder, movements sharper. You're not just taking the resource, you're racing time before other animals get to it, before heat spoils meat, before weather changes. Then comes carrying. Food in foraging life is often bulky, awkward, and heavy. Firewood, roots, shellfish, carcass pieces, water in skins or clay vessels. Carrying isn't glamorous, but it dominates the energy budget. In many groups, women and older children spent hours each day walking with loads, while men might come back from a long hunt burdened with a single dense haul. Again, this isn't constant max effort. Loads get shifted from one shoulder to another. People pause, set baskets down, stretch backs, adjust straps. Children are traded off between adults. The group might take a slightly longer route home that follows a stream, because the microclimate is cooler and the footing is better, even if the distance is greater. The goal isn't to hit 10,000 steps, it's to get everyone and everything back without heatstroke or injury. If you put a heart rate monitor on one of your ancestors during a typical foraging day, the graph probably wouldn't look like a single big spike. It would be more like a sawtooth pattern. Moderate effort walking, short spikes when something demanding happens, dips when the group stops in shade to process food, feed a child, tell a story, argue about which way to go next. Now fold all of that back into sleep. Circadian biology loves two things: strong light cues and a clear contrast between active and inactive periods. Foragers had both. They spent huge chunks of the day outdoors, bathed in full daylight, moving their bodies in varied low to medium intensity ways. Even if the total energy expenditure wasn't as extreme as some romantic images suggest, the pattern hours of on-your-feet engagement followed by real darkness would have built solid sleep pressure by evening. There's also a mental version of this, that continuous low-level cognitive load, tracking routes, remembering plant locations, noting social information about neighbouring groups, is tiring in a different way than, say, answering emails. You're not just physically spent, your navigational and decision-making circuits have been humming all day. When the sun finally drops and you no longer have enough light to safely walk, there's a natural sense of closure. The map updating can pause. The day's choices are made. In that sense, a forager's workday was less about punching the clock and more about riding the landscape. Walk, scan, gather, carry, speed up, slow down, use cool hours and shade. Keep track of where you are, what's around you, and who you're with. By the time firelight replaces sunlight, your body has accumulated exactly the kind of mixed physical and mental fatigue that makes a solid night's sleep not just possible, but almost inevitable, assuming nothing in the dark decides to interrupt. Farming breaks that rhythm. Once people start depending on fields instead of wild patches, the day is no longer mostly about walking through options. It's about returning to the same pieces of ground, over and over, doing the same actions until the season changes. The landscape still sets the rules, but now it does it through a calendar. There's a window for getting seeds into the soil, a window when weeds can be controlled, a window when water has to reach the roots, a window when crops must be harvested before weather, mould or animals take their share. So instead of every day being a flexible mix of walk, scan, gather, carry, early farmers lived inside long, slow waves of effort. Planting season is the first big wave. For a few weeks, maybe a couple of months, the work is relentless. You're up when the light is barely good enough to see, because every cool hour matters. The soil has a certain moisture now. The rains have started but not fully soaked the fields. If you miss this band in the calendar, you don't get another try. There's no supermarket to fill in the gaps, so the day becomes simple and brutal. Open the ground, drop seed, cover it. Step, bend, reach, step, bend, reach. If you're using a digging stick or an early plough, you repeat the same motions hundreds of times. If you're sowing by hand, your arm swings in the same arc from dawn until your shoulder feels as if it's made of stone. Later, harvest season brings the second wave. Another narrow window, this time on the other end of the cycle. The grain is ripe enough to be worth cutting, but not yet shattering off the stalk. The weather is still dry enough that what you cut can cure before you store it. Storms now are not just inconvenient, they are disaster. So again, the schedule tightens: cut, bundle, carry, cut, bundle, carry. If you're threshing with flails or beating grain from heads, it's another set of repeated swings, another loop of the same movement, until your muscles stop feeling like individual parts and turn into one big ache. Between those peaks there are quieter stretches, but not empty ones. Farming comes with a whole ecosystem of chores that don't care if you're bored. Weeding is one of them. Plants don't just grow, everything grows. If you don't pull, chop, or somehow suppress the competitors, your crops lose. So someone walks the same rows again and again, hunting a much smaller, more annoying kind of prey. You bend, reach, tug, and move 3 steps down the line. Bend, reach, tug. Repeat until your hamstrings and lower back throb. Irrigation adds its own routines where water isn't exactly where you want it. Early canals have to be dug, cleared of silt, patched when they leak, Dirt embankments slump and need shoring up. Simple ditches clog with mud or plant growth. That means time with a hoe or shovel, lifting and turning soil in a way that looks like a gym workout, stripped of all novelty. Back at the house or storage area, the work gets finer, but no less repetitive. Grain doesn't leap from stalk to bread by itself. It has to be dried, stored, then later hulled and ground. Grinding grain, especially before metal tools and rotary mills, is a slow grind on the body too. Archaeologists find the evidence written directly onto skeletons. Women and men from early farming communities show deep grooves in the knee joints, arthritic changes in the spine, and deformation in the shoulders and elbows, consistent with hours a day spent kneeling and rocking a heavy stone back and forth. The wear patterns on teeth, the shape of vertebrae, the thickened areas where muscles once pulled hard on bone, all tell the same story. Repetitive, focused labour that loads the same joints in the same ways for years. Even tool repair and fence maintenance, the light chores stack up. A wooden hoe blade splits, a digging stick wears down. A simple fence to keep animals out of fields rots, leans or gets knocked over. So you carve more stakes, braid more weeds, drag more brush. The motions aren't complex, but they are cumulative. There's no season when nothing breaks. All of this reshapes fatigue. A forager's day scatters effort across muscles and movements. A farmer's year concentrates it. You might spend weeks doing almost the same thing every day, loading the same tendons, the same parts of your back and shoulders. It's no surprise that early agricultural skeletons often look more beaten up than those of their foraging neighbours, even when people are roughly the same age. So how did that feel in terms of sleep? In the peak seasons, the connection is blunt. You go to bed early because you're used up, and because dawn tomorrow is already spoken for. When your family's chance of eating next year depends on how many rows you finish this week, staying up to chat by the fire becomes an obvious luxury. Night isn't just the end of light, it's the only full stop your body gets. But farming doesn't always mean early nights and long sleep. Once the planting rush is done or the grain is safely stacked away, evenings can stretch again. There are still chores, animals to check, tools to tidy, fires to manage, but the sense of emergency drops. In many traditional farming communities, the off-peak parts of the year become the social season. People stay up later talking, telling stories, working on crafts or participating in rituals, precisely because tomorrow's work is predictable and less frantic. There's another twist too, mental stress. Foragers live with daily uncertainty. Will we find enough food today? Farmers live with seasonal uncertainty. Did we do enough early enough to carry us until next harvest? Once you tie your survival to big all-or-nothing pulses of stored food, a new kind of anxiety appears, storage anxiety. You know exactly how many jars, baskets or pits you filled. You can see the grain level slowly sinking over months. You're counting rats, watching for mould, tracking what you've traded away and what you still need to keep. On a cold, windy night halfway between harvests, lying wide awake and staring into the dark, you're not worrying about where to find food tomorrow. You're replaying decisions you made months ago. Should we have planted more? Did we harvest early enough? Is that leaking roof above the granary going to ruin everything? Workload planning itself becomes a kind of ongoing mental labour. You're no longer just adjusting to what the landscape offers each day. You're trying to anticipate problems far in advance. When to repair the canal before the rainy season? When to cull animals before grazing runs short? How many days you can spare for building a new storage pit without falling behind on field work? All of that thinking doesn't weigh much, but it presses on sleep. So in farming life, the body often reaches for earlier bedtimes in the physically intense stretches, while the mind sometimes resists rest during the quieter ones. Physical exhaustion pushes you toward deeper, faster sleep. Long-term worry tugs in the opposite direction. Taken together, early agriculture didn't just change what people did with their days. It changed the texture of their fatigue, from varied landscape-driven effort to cycles of repetitive labour and long, slow-burning stress, setting up a very different relationship between work, worry and the sleep that followed. If work reshaped fatigue, food reshaped the rhythm wrapped around it. In a foraging world, breakfast in our sense barely exists. There's no cupboard to open, no guaranteed bowl of anything waiting. What you have in the morning depends on what you did yesterday, and what the landscape feels like giving you today. So the first meal after waking is often just whatever's around. Maybe someone cached roasted tubers in the ashes the night before, still edible in the cool morning. Maybe there's dried meat or a basket of nuts that survived the last few days. Maybe ripe fruit is hanging 20 meters from where people slept. And the first task after stretching awake is to wander over and eat it straight off the branch. Anthropologists watching modern foragers see a lot of grazing. A handful of berries here, a piece of leftover meat there, a snack shared, and then back to walking. The line between meal and snack blurs. Early in the day, people often take the edge off hunger rather than sit down for a formal spread. That has sleep consequences. When food is scattered through the day, blood sugar and gut activity never spike quite as hard as they do when you drop a huge load of calories in one sitting. The first calories of the day arrive slowly as the group gets moving. Your circadian clock, synced to dawn light, gets a second, gentler time cue from those early bites, telling the body, yes, daytime has really started, metabolism can ramp up. Farming begins to change this picture, but not all at once. Once you have stores, grain, dried pulses, preserved roots, you can choose to eat more predictably. Suddenly, something in the morning is easier to guarantee. Porridge, flatbread, a drink made from watered-down leftovers of last night's stew. These become typical morning habits in many agrarian societies. Even then, breakfast can be light. In some traditional farming cultures, the first hours of light are for getting into the fields before the heat. People might drink something warm, nibble on yesterday's bread, and save the serious eating for mid-morning, once the most valuable cool work hours are over. On the other end of the day, though, things shift more dramatically. For mobile foragers, the biggest concentration of food often lands in the late afternoon or early evening, after a hunt returns or a particularly rich patch of plants has been harvested. You've had small bites all day, but the main social event, cooking, dividing, feasting, is more likely to happen when everyone is back together and no one has to watch for leopards while chewing. That means a loaded gut near bedtime. A large evening meal can feel calming in the moment. The post-meal parasympathetic rest and digest state can make eyelids heavy. In a world without artificial light, where darkness hits hard, the sequence eat, talk, do a few chores, sleep probably flows quite naturally from sunset most of the year. But digestion doesn't care that you're ready for oblivion. A huge bolus of meat and hard-to-break-down fibre sits in the stomach for hours. Core body temperature rises slightly with digestion, when the brain prefers it to drop for the deepest sleep. If the meat is very fatty, if the tubers are full of resistant starch, if you had to gorge because tomorrow might be lean, the night becomes a tug-of-war between drowsiness and a busy gut. Some nights that's fine. In a high-activity, high-expenditure life, you simply pass out anyway. But over years, this pattern, light through the day, heavy at night, creates a very different sleep texture than a modern, front-loaded eating schedule. Early farmers face a new trade-off. With stores and cooking pots, They can distribute calories more evenly. A morning porridge, midday bread and cheese or beans, an evening stew. That smoother curve is friendlier to stable energy and less disruptive to sleep. But culture steps in and rearranges things again. In some agrarian settings, the main meal migrates firmly to the evening, after fieldwork is done and animals are seen too. You don't have time to sit for an hour at noon when the weeds are winning, so you eat quickly under a tree, then save the elaborate multi-dish family meal for when the sun is low. Now you have a predictable, very large evening intake, plus the social expectation to linger, talk, maybe sing or pray. Sleep gets pushed later. The body is tired and wants darkness. The culture is full and wants connection. The content of those meals matters too. Foragers eat a high-fibre, high-diversity diet almost by default. Roots, leaves, nuts, insects, small animals, occasional large game, seasonal fruit, protein spread across the day, fibre in nearly every bite, fats coming mostly in whole food packages. That keeps digestion slow and gut microbes very busy. It also means the body is almost constantly doing low-level digestive work rather than flipping between empty and overloaded. Early farmers, in contrast, slide toward grain-heavy staples. Wheat, barley, rice, millet, maize, dense, storable energy, but often eaten in big, relatively low-fibre doses once you remove husks and process them. In some early agricultural skeletons, you see more dental problems and signs of metabolic stress, clues to diets that spike blood sugar more sharply and repeatedly. For sleep, the difference looks like this. A forager's gut is rarely slammed with refined starch. A farmer's gut often is. Evening bowls of polished grain porridge or flatbread can give quick satiety and a glucose rush, followed by a crash, sometimes paired with restless shallow sleep as blood sugar wobbles during the night. Then there are the ferments. Wherever humans had the time and surplus to experiment, something started bubbling. Fermented milks, lightly alcoholic grain or honey drinks, fermented fruits and palm saps. By the time you have settled communities and storage vessels, you have microbes turning sugar into alcohol and acids. Alcohol before bed is a seductive tool. It makes people fall asleep faster, loosens social barriers in the dim light, and can turn the evening meal into a warm blur rather than a cold debrief of the day's worries. But physiologically, it shreds sleep quality. It fragments the second half of the night, suppresses REM in early cycles, and then causes a rebound later and can worsen breathing problems. So in villages where beer is really a mildly alcoholic porridge, and everyone drinks some with the evening meal, bedtime might feel easier. Even as deeper, restorative sleep gets quietly eroded in the background. On the flip side, fermented foods with very little alcohol, sour porridges, pickled vegetables, yogurts, can improve digestion and gut health, potentially smoothing nighttime comfort rather than disrupting it. Overlaying all of this are rituals, feasts and fasts that bend the daily pattern around special meanings. A successful hunt, a harvest, a birth, a funeral. These often come with socially mandated overeating. Mountains of meat, special breads, rare sweet foods rolled out, because this matters. People stay up later, eat well past dark, and go to sleep with stomachs at absolute capacity. The night after a feast might be deep but turbulent, heavy limbs, vivid dreams, more tossing and turning as an overfull belly tries to sort itself out. Fasts work the other way. Many historic and traditional societies set aside days or seasons when you eat less, or not at all during daylight, or avoid certain foods. Those rules aren't written for sleep, but they touch it anyway. If you've gone light on food all day for ritual reasons, the evening meal can hit harder, or sometimes be intentionally sparse too. People may fall asleep faster from general fatigue, But the body is also dealing with lower energy reserves and altered hormone patterns. In some fasting traditions, late-night prayers or vigils pair deliberately reduced food with deliberately reduced sleep, turning metabolic strain into a spiritual tool. For our ancestors, then, what did you eat, and when, wasn't a side note. It was a quiet, constant force shaping when eyelids drooped, how smoothly the body moved into deep sleep, and how often the night was broken by a churning gut, a racing heart after a sugar swing, or a brain nudged awake by the last cups of grain beer. And all of that played out against another powerful daily rhythm they couldn't escape: heat. Heat isn't just uncomfortable. For most of human history, in most of the places we evolved, it was the daily wall you hit. Once the sun is high, especially in open savanna or exposed fields, being active becomes metabolically expensive. Your muscles generate more heat as they work, your core temperature climbs, and now your body has to spend water and energy just to keep from cooking your brain. So another pattern emerges almost automatically. The middle of the day slows down. In hot, high-sun environments, laziness at noon is actually competence. Animals shift to shade. Birds go quiet. Your ancestors read the same signal. You get your serious walking, digging, carrying and hunting in, while the light is still soft and the air is relatively cool. As the sun climbs toward its peak, the value of each extra effort minute drops, and the cost, heat load, dehydration, risk of heat stroke rises. The logical response is to stop. Shade is the first technology here. A rock overhang, a tree with dense leaves, the shadow of a cliff or a hut. These patches are worth reshaping your entire day around. Under that cooler air, sweating actually works. Heart rate and body temperature can drift back down. You drink whatever you have. Water, thin gruel, watery fruit. You talk quietly, sort tools, pick thorns out of your feet. You wait. Inside that waiting, something else slips in. Sleep. Biologists talk about a post-lunch dip in alertness, as if it's some mysterious modern afternoon slump, but our brains are naturally biphasic. We have a strong drive for sleep at night, anchored to darkness, and a smaller bump in sleepiness roughly in the early afternoon, anchored to our internal clock and often reinforced by food. In a hot pre-industrial world, those two forces, heat and biology, push in the same direction. Midday is the worst time to move and the easiest time to doze. But nap doesn't always mean what we think it does. Sometimes it's real sleep, 10, 20, 40 minutes, where you actually slide into light non-REM, maybe a brief drop into deeper stages. Modern studies in hot rural communities show exactly this. Short, opportunistic naps under trees, on verandas, in field shelters, without changing clothes or going to bed. The body takes a little off the nighttime pressure, then gives you back a bit more sharpness for the later afternoon. Other times, though, it's more like quiet wakefulness. Eyes half closed, mind drifting, but still tracking voices, still vaguely aware of the environment. That state can be surprisingly restorative. Heart rate is down, muscles are still, heat production is lower, and you're not using up attention on active tasks. In small groups, someone is usually more awake, more alert, so the group as a whole keeps some level of vigilance, even while most people are out of gear. This slow band in the middle of the day isn't just physiologically useful. It's socially productive too. If you're not rowing or hoeing or chasing anything, you can do low exertion work, sharpening stone edges, rebinding a spear, mending nets, or weaving cordage. All of these can be done sitting or squatting in the shade, with long pauses whenever the heat or drowsiness presses harder. It's also prime time for talking. Storytelling doesn't have to wait for the fire. Under midday shade, kids pester adults with questions. Elders rehearse old hunts or old famines. Plans are made for tomorrow's movements or next season's planting. Knowledge that doesn't fit easily into motion. How to read clouds when a plant is dangerous, who owes whom a favour, gets passed along in words during these slower hours. Childcare folds naturally into this. Younger children who got up with the dawn may crash hard at midday, curled against a parent or grandparent. Babies nurse, then go limp. Adults rotate between light dozing and keeping an eye on the little ones wandering at the edge of the shade. The pause in heavy work creates a window where the group can invest attention in its most vulnerable members without sacrificing the crucial cool hours of morning or evening. Over long stretches of time, living this way nudges sleep patterns towards something that looks biphasic, one big block anchored to night, one small block or at least a valley of lowered alertness around midday. Not everywhere, not always, and not as some rigid clocked siesta, but as a flexible response to climate and workload. In cooler regions or in seasons when days are short and temperatures mild, that midday rest shrinks or disappears. The heat penalty is smaller, so the cost of continuous work through noon is lower. In some early farming societies at high latitudes, the driving concern isn't avoiding midday sun. It's cramming as much work as possible into a narrow frost-free season. Here, naps might be rare luxuries, not daily habits. That variability is important when we project backward. There probably wasn't a single human rule about naps. Instead, there were conditions that made a second daily rest block more or less appealing. Strong sun, long hot seasons, heavy morning labour, and the presence of safe shade and social backup, so that not everyone had to stay fully alert at once. Which makes our modern no-nap ideal look very strange in context. In offices and factories built to run on a continuous 8-hour shift, drowsiness at 2 in the afternoon is treated as a failure of willpower or a sign you didn't sleep right last night. Caffeine, bright screens and air conditioning are brought in to flatten the natural dip and bulldoze through the heat or post-meal lull. But nothing in our evolutionary story suggests that pushing straight through midday is inherently better for health or sleep. For many of our ancestors, backing off in the hottest, sleepiest slice of the day was just good engineering. It protected brains and bodies from overheating, spread recovery out instead of cramming it all into the dark, and opened a social space for low-intensity tasks and shared culture. When night finally came, the body that had spent an hour dozing under a tree didn't forget how to sleep. It arrived at darkness with a slightly altered pressure, maybe a bit less desperate at first, maybe with sleep spread out differently across the night. But the real advantage was that it arrived there, not wrung out by heat, but intact enough to face whatever the dark might bring. So far we've been talking as if the body is a single unit making clean decisions about when to rest. But your ancestors never lived as isolated units. They lived inside households, bands, extended families. And that changes everything, because now sleep isn't just about what's best for your own nervous system. It's about how your tiredness fits into everyone else's. Start with the most basic fact of human life. Children. In a small foraging band or an early farming household, childcare is not a side project. It's the main background process of the entire day. Infants wake whenever they want, not when the adults would find it convenient. Toddlers wander toward the fire, toward the river, toward the edge of camp. Slightly older kids are surprisingly competent, but they're also loud, impulsive, and inclined to test limits. Modern parents know how much this fragments rest. Now imagine you don't have doors, separate nurseries, baby monitors, or the option to put on headphones and pretend the chaos isn't happening. Sound carries through hide shelters, brush huts, thin walls. A crying infant at night is everyone's problem. The solution isn't one heroic sleep-deprived mother. It's distributed vigilance. Anthropologists call it cooperative breeding. Grandmothers, aunts, older siblings, even non-relatives all pitch in. In many foraging societies studied today, a baby might be held by a dozen different people in a single day. That doesn't happen because everyone is sentimental. It happens because it spreads the cost. No one adult has to stay fully alert all day and all night. But spreading the cost doesn't mean anyone gets perfect, uninterrupted sleep. Instead, you get a patchwork, dozing while someone else rocks the baby, grabbing a brief nap when the infant finally settles against a cousin, half sleeping with one ear open, because tonight it's your turn to be the light sleeper near the entrance. For adults of reproductive age, especially women, prehistoric sleep probably looked choppier than the idealized solid 8 hours. More awakenings, more micro-arousals, more flexible timing. The trade-off was survival of their children, and, by extension, their genes. Now fold teenagers into this picture. Across cultures and time, human adolescents tend to drift later. They're more alert at night, slower to wake in the morning. Modern life makes that shift painfully obvious because school bells and alarm clocks slam into it. But the basic chronotype change seems to be biological, not a product of smartphones. In a small pre-industrial group, that shift could be an asset. Younger kids wake early and collapse early. Adults of childbearing age need some continuous sleep to repair the wear and tear of heavy work, pregnancy, lactation. Teenagers, meanwhile, are half children, half adults. They can work, but they also naturally feel awake later into the evening. That makes them perfect bridge people, when the fire is low and most of the camp is drifting off. Adolescents might still be talking, flirting, arguing, singing. They're the ones stretching the social day into the night. But they're also, intentionally or not, part of the safety system, more likely to be awake when a predator sniffs too close, or when a neighbouring group arrives late, or when an ember throws a spark toward dry grass. Some researchers have even modelled this. If you mix chronotypes in a group, with some people preferring early bedtimes and others preferring late ones, you almost automatically get coverage across the whole night without formal scheduling. Someone is always more awake than the rest. Teenagers and elders are prime candidates for those edge-of-night roles. Which brings us to elders. In a harsh world, living long enough to become an elder was an achievement. Your value to the group wasn't in brute force anymore, it was in information. Elders know which valley floods every 20 years, which root looks edible but will twist your guts, which neighbouring clan can be trusted, and which must never see you vulnerable. Biologically, aging tends to fragment sleep. Older people wake more during the night, get up to urinate, have lighter, earlier sleep. In a modern, individualistic context, that's framed as a problem. Insomnia, poor sleep quality. In a small, interdependent group, the same pattern can be reinterpreted as a feature. The elder who wakes before dawn can quietly tend the coals, check the perimeter, soothe the fussing grandchild so the exhausted mother can keep sleeping. The one whose sleep is shallow may be the first to hear an unusual rustle in the grass or a distant human voice. You don't need a formal watch rotation when your age-structured biology already biases some people toward midnight and others toward morning. So you have children pushing wakefulness into the day and puncturing the night with cries. You have teens surfacing late and lingering awake. You have elders whose sleep is lighter and more fragmented. Put that all together inside one shelter or one cluster of shelters around a common fire, and bedtime stops looking like a synchronized event. It looks like waves. Shared sleeping space amplifies this. Most of our ancestors did not sleep alone in quiet, isolated rooms. They slept in piles, lines, clusters, parents next to infants, siblings tangling together, cousins and unrelated juveniles jostling on the same mat, dogs or other commensal animals curled at feet and doorways. That proximity has obvious benefits: shared warmth, shared protection, rapid response if something goes wrong. But it also means your sleep is constantly entangled with other people's movements and noises. One person rolling over can bump 3 others. A dreamer muttering in their sleep wakes the nearest light sleeper, who shifts and wakes the next. The result is not necessarily less total sleep, but more distributed sleep. More brief awakenings, more fluid transitions between shallow sleep and quiet wakefulness. Instead of a private 8-hour black box, you get a communal night with many small ripples. Family structure then becomes a kind of hidden scheduler. In a camp with lots of small children, adult nights may be busier and adult midday rest more fiercely protected. In a household where grandparents are present, mothers might get longer stretches of uninterrupted night sleep, with grandmothers taking some early morning or late night soothing duties. In a group that recently lost elders, the middle-aged may have to stay up later or get up earlier, tightening their own sleep to cover the gap in knowledge and vigilance. Even economic roles feed into this. A skilled hunter who must be sharp at dawn may plead or be granted an earlier bedtime and more protection from nighttime disturbances, while adolescents who aren't yet full providers absorb more of the late-night socializing and low-level watchfulness. In early farming villages, someone responsible for watering fields at first light might be allowed to duck out of some evening rituals to bank sleep. Seen this way, sleep isn't an individual habit, it's an emergent property of the household. The daily pattern of who stays up, who lies down, who half dozes, and who is on call at any given hour is shaped as much by age distribution, kinship ties, and role expectations as by sunrise and sunset. Your inner clock matters, but so does your position in the web of people around you. Only after that web is in place, children, teens, elders, shared spaces, roles woven into a 24-hour cycle, does it really make sense to ask where exactly those bodies are lying down? And that's where the story turns to shelter itself, what people actually slept on, and how those surfaces shaped the way they passed the night. Once you start looking at where people actually lay their heads, the romance drains out of sleeping under the stars pretty fast. Your body cares about things you don't usually put in bedtime stories: moisture, wind, biting insects, smoke in your lungs, the temperature of the ground pulling heat out of your blood. For most of human history, what people did for sleep all day included a quiet, constant battle against those forces. The most basic move was to put something between you and the earth. If you're imagining bare dirt and a heroic fur cloak, that's more movie than reality. Archaeologists have found 200,000-year-old traces of layered grass bedding in South African rock shelters, mats of sedges and reeds laid down, then replaced over time. Plant stems overlap in ways that look less like random litter and more like deliberate weaving and piling. Why bother? Because the ground is a heat sink. Lie directly on cold soil and it will suck warmth out of you all night, even if you have a hide over you. A few centimeters of dry plant matter turns that conductive heat loss into insulating still air pockets. It also adds softness, spreads pressure, and crucially can be renewed. When it gets damp, mouldy, or full of bugs, you rake it out and bring in fresh stuff. On top of that base, you get hides, cloaks, and later woven mats. Animal skins are basically prehistoric performance fabrics. Hair on hides trap air for insulation. Hair off, tanned leather sheds water and wind. A single large hide can be both mattress and blanket. Several layered become a serious barrier against cold and damp. Early farmers add textiles to this stack: rough wool blankets, stuffed mattresses with straw or chaff, simple plaited mats of rushes or palm leaves. The layering game is about more than comfort. It's about microclimate control. Now think about fire. Where you put the hearth relative to where you sleep is a constant trade-off between warmth, light, smoke, and safety. Too far and you freeze. Too close and your eyes sting, your lungs burn, your bedding smoulders at 3 a.m. In caves and rock shelters, smoke is both a problem and a tool. Fires tend to sit near the centre, or just inside the overhang, where drafts can carry smoke up and out. But some of that smoke inevitably pools at the ceiling and seeps down. That's irritating in the short term, yet there's a side benefit. Smoke is insecticide. It drives away mosquitoes and sandflies, kills or repels fleas and ticks in bedding, and helps preserve stored meat and hides. So you see hearths that look like carefully managed systems. Charcoal and ash raked, fresh fuel added at particular times, maybe even small smoky smudge fires lit specifically to gas out pests before people settle in. Eyes watering a bit at night might be a price worth paying if it means fewer bites, fewer diseases, less scratching until dawn. Pest control didn't stop with smoke. If your sleeping surface is basically a pile of organic matter, grass, fur, wool, you've essentially built paradise for fleas and lice. You can't buy a mattress cover and call it a day, so people used rotation and exposure as weapons. Bedding dragged into the sun to bake, mats hung on poles to air, hides scraped, smoked, and occasionally abandoned when the infestation got too intense. Daily grooming fits into this ecosystem too. Nitpicking isn't just a metaphor, it's a social activity with immune benefits. One person inspecting another's hair or seams for lice, squashing them between nails, is part grooming, part bonding, part public health. Before chemical treatments, your only options were mechanical removal, occasional shaving or trimming, and trying to make your immediate surroundings as hostile to bugs as possible. Rodents presented a different problem. Grain stores, scraps of meat, and dropped food drew mice and rats to human shelters as soon as we started staying put. They're noisy, disease-carrying, and not shy about running across your body at night. Countermeasures ranged from keeping food off the floor, hung in baskets, tucked into suspended containers, to exploiting another creature entirely, dogs and, later, cats. A camp with semi-tame dogs curled near the entrance and prowling the perimeter at night doesn't just gain an alarm system, it gains pest control. All of this pushes toward one obvious solution. Get off the ground. Elevation, dryness, and airflow are the holy trinity of a better night's sleep outside of climate control. Even a simple raised platform of branches, poles, or packed earth solves multiple problems at once. You're above the worst of the damp ground layer. Cool air can circulate under you, reducing mold and mildew. Many crawling insects have a harder time reaching you. Rodents are forced to climb where you can feel them, see them, or where a dog can intercept them. Ethnographers see this in tropical societies using hammocks or high sleeping shelves, and archaeologists infer similar setups from post holes and wear patterns in ancient houses. In colder places, elevation shows up as thick, built-up sleeping platforms near the warmest part of the house. Benches of earth or wood by the hearth, sometimes insulated with straw, sometimes covered in furs. Dryness might sound trivial, until you imagine weeks of drizzle with no synthetic rain gear. Clothes never fully dry. The ground stays soggy, wood smokes more than it burns. In that world, a dry, slightly elevated spot is gold. You might spend a good chunk of your day just arranging roofing materials, draining runoff, patching leaks, and fluffing bedding so that tonight for a few hours your body isn't in contact with cold moisture. The exact shapes of these sleeping arrangements vary wildly by region. Cave and rock shelter dwellers use the geology. deeper sleeping zones tucked away from drafts, with hearths near the mouth. In open savannas and temperate woodlands you see light, easily rebuilt shelters, brush huts, lean-tos and circular houses where mats and hides can be rolled up by day and spread by night. In northern forests and steppe, semi-subterranean houses and longhouses concentrate bodies and heat. Think of a long, shared interior with raised side platforms lined with straw and pelts, a central hearth, smoke venting through the roof, or simply seeping out through the thatch. Dozens of people might sleep in one structure, their combined body heat turning it into a low-tech incubator through winter. Then come the first dense towns and cities, and sleep becomes an urban problem. Now your shelter might be a cramped upper story room, a corner of a courtyard, or a shared loft above animals. Elevation helps with damp and some crawling pests, but you inherit new issues: thin walls, neighbours snoring or arguing, streets and alleys serving as nocturnal highways for humans and vermin alike. Bedding materials are similar: straw, wool-woven mats, but they're packed closer together on wooden floors or hard plaster, within buildings that trap not just heat, but also smells and smoke. Through all of this variation, the logic is consistent. People spend their days nudging their sleeping environment toward a narrow target. Warm but not suffocating, sheltered but not airless, close to the fire but not in it, separated from the ground but still integrated with the group. Every mat shaken out, every hide smoked, every platform rebuilt after a storm is a small investment in what happens after dark. Once the bodies, the bedding and the shelter are in place, one last ingredient shapes the night more than any pillow ever could: what you do with fire when the sun goes down. When the sun drops, your ancestors don't disappear into blackness. They shift into firelight mode, and that firelight is doing something very specific to their bodies. A decent campfire, a couple of torches, an oil lamp in a farming house. These are bright to your eyes in the dark, but in absolute terms they're tiny. Measured in lux, they're often in the range of a dim restaurant or darker. Compare that to daylight, which hits your face at tens of thousands of lux, even on an overcast day. To your circadian system, the difference is like standing next to a waterfall all afternoon and then listening to a trickle at night. Modern studies on candles and weak, warm light show that melatonin, the hormone that tells your body night has started, barely budges until you're very close to the flame and staring right at it. The blue-rich light from phones, LEDs and bright bulbs is much more effective at suppressing melatonin. Fire, by contrast, is heavy on red and infrared, relatively poor in the short wavelengths that most aggressively tell your brain, it's midday again. So for a forager sitting a metre or two back from the flames, most of their retina is seeing dark. The background is black, the stars are out, their body is already sliding down the hormonal ramp towards sleep. Firelight stretches functional wakefulness a bit, but it doesn't rip their internal clock off the wall the way a midnight scroll does. What do you do with that gentle, flickering bonus time? You squeeze in all the tasks that need eyes and hands but not full daylight. Cooking is the obvious one. Evening is when many groups process whatever the day produced: roasting meat, boiling tubers, grinding grains. In a hunter-gatherer camp, you might see nuts being cracked, seeds winnowed, marrow bones split open for fat. Among early farmers, this balloons into serious labour, soaking and pounding dried legumes so they won't poison you, parching grain, stirring pots so they don't scorch, baking flatbreads on hot stones. Next to the cooks, someone is always fixing something. Fibres get twisted into cord, nets are mended, baskets rewoven where they've started to sag. You sharpen stone blades or metal knives by feel as much as sight, listening to the scrape, testing edges with a thumb. Spears, arrows, hoes, and digging sticks are inspected, bindings tightened, hafts repaired. A day's hard use roughs up gear. Evening is when you reset it for tomorrow. This is also prime time for slow, meticulous work. Weaving and spinning happen here a lot in farming and pastoral societies. Wool or plant fibres can be drafted into thread by lamplight. Simple looms and backstrap weaving rigs don't need warehouse lighting. Your hands learn the pattern. Leather is cut and stitched, sandals resewn, beads strung. Food is processed for storage. Fruit sliced and laid out, strips of meat threaded and hung near the coals to smoke overnight. None of this is done in silence. If daylight is for moving the body through the landscape, evening is for moving information through the group. Around that fire, stories are currency, entertainment, and education all at once. Myths about how the river got its bend, tales of ancestral heroes, jokes about the incompetent hunter who speared his own foot. The content varies, but the function is consistent. You're practicing memory under pressure, long narratives repeated night after night, with the group ready to call you out if you skip a key part. This isn't just for fun. Oral cultures depend on accuracy. Firelight is when children hear, again and again, where the good waterholes are, how to recognize poisonous berries, what happened the last time someone cut across that sacred hill instead of going around. The brain, already drifting towards sleep, is being loaded with vivid, emotionally sticky material. That's exactly the kind of input that consolidates well overnight. Teaching slips in almost invisibly. Elders correct a knot as a child tries to lash a handle. Someone demonstrates how to hold a spindle or the right way to scrape a hide without tearing it. A teenager tries telling a story and gets gently or not so gently mocked until they get the details right. Firelight becomes a low-stakes classroom where mistakes aren't lethal, just embarrassing. Evening roles here aren't randomly assigned. In many documented foraging societies, women do a large share of the nighttime food processing, grinding, pounding, sorting, cooking. Men might be more involved in weapon maintenance or planning the next day's hunt or foray. Kids help where they can or cluster at the edge of adult tasks, soaking in technique and gossip. Age shapes the evening too. Elders whose knees and backs may not handle long walks anymore become the resident archives. They tell the longest stories, remember the old roots, recite genealogies. They may sit closer to the fire for warmth, drawing the youngest children in with them. Adolescents, buzzing with energy, might drift between groups, flirting, showing off, learning adult conversations. These patterns aren't universal. Some farming households put men by the hearth and send women to milk animals at dusk. Others reverse it. But across cultures you often see evenings reinforcing who does what in that society. Tasks, talk, and seating patterns all encode status, gender, and age. What you don't usually see, at least before widespread artificial lighting, is the kind of chronic, late-night wakefulness many of us treat as normal. Fuel is limited. Wood, dung, charcoal, oil, none of it is free in time or effort. Keeping a big roaring fire blazing until midnight. Every night is expensive. Smoke builds up. Sparks fly. Predators and enemies can see a bright flame from far away. So fires tend to be managed. Flames built high for cooking and work, then allowed to sink into glowing coals. As the light dims, activities narrow. Fine work stops when you can't see the fibres. Conversation slows or shifts to murmurs. People drift from the outside of the circle toward their sleeping spots. Maybe a few insomniacs or night watch types stay up to feed the coals and listen to the darkness. But most of the group is horizontal not long after true night sets in. So evenings are rich, socially intense, mentally stimulating, filled with tasks and talk, but they're happening under a light source that doesn't slam the brakes on melatonin, and usually isn't strong or cheap enough to justify extreme bedtime procrastination. The result is a paradox we've mostly lost, a few hours of genuine prime time before sleep, fully alive with work and stories that nevertheless flow naturally into the night's next phase. Whatever that phase looks like, once the sounds outside the circle of firelight start to matter more than the glow itself. At some point, the voices trail off and the last joke dies in the smoke. Now, the loudest thing is the dark. If you've ever camped far from roads, you know this phase. The fire shrinks, the stars feel closer, your eyes aren't doing much anymore, so your brain turns the gain knob on your ears and skin. Every rustle is suddenly important. For your ancestors, that wasn't a vibe. It was a survival strategy. Predation risk isn't constant. It changes with landscape, season, and who else is sharing the ecosystem with you. In dense African savanna with lions, hyenas and leopards, the night has a very different meaning than in a cold, open steppe, where the main danger is a pack of wolves. In tropical forest, you're listening for big cats above you. In open woodland, you worry about something charging from the dark. On a treeless plain, the risk drops if you can see silhouettes against the sky a long way off, but only if the moon is out and the horizon isn't hidden by mist. So groups don't just go to bed, they arrange themselves in relation to these risks. Archaeologists can't dig up fear directly, but they can see its shadows. Cave and rock shelter sites show repeated use of deep, defensible spots, narrow entrances, back chambers. Open-air camps often cluster near cliffs or water, one less direction to defend. Ethnographies of foragers from Africa to Australia describe similar logic. Don't camp right in thick bush that hides stalkers, but don't sleep totally exposed either. Choose a place where approach paths are limited and noisy. Then they layer on technology. Fire is one of the oldest anti-predator devices we have. It doesn't just give light and heat, it projects a zone of nope for many large carnivores. Even today, lions are less likely to approach lively, smoky camps. Hunter-gatherers use this. They don't just build one central blaze and walk away. They maintain rings of small fires, or drag burning logs outward before sleep, so the perimeter glows in patches. The positioning of bodies mirrors that perimeter. Kids and the frail tend to the center. Adults, especially those with weapons, drift to the edges. In some pastoral groups, humans literally sleep inside a ring of livestock, which themselves form a noisy living alarm system. Among certain foragers, people angle their heads toward the fire, or toward likely danger directions, so that any sound snaps them awake facing the noise. And then there are the four-legged early warning systems. The partnership between humans and canids is, among other things, a sleep technology. Once wolves start the long, messy process of becoming dogs, they bring with them an evolutionary package humans don't have: ridiculously sensitive hearing, a nose that can read the air like a newspaper, and a hair-trigger response to anything weird. A dog doesn't have to fight off a leopard to be useful. It just has to bark at 3 a.m. We don't know exactly when this became common, but by the time you get to late foragers and early herders in Eurasia, dogs are everywhere in the archaeology, and oral traditions routinely describe them as guardians. A growl at the edge of camp is a free extension of your nervous system into the dark. Predators, though, are only half the night's story. The other half is humans. Once there are stored resources worth stealing: meat drying on racks, bags of grain, herds of animals, worked tools. Night is when you can take them with the least resistance. Raiding, rustling and quiet theft all follow the same logic predators do. Strike when your target is groggy, scattered and blind. that reshapes sleeping arrangements again. In early farming villages, houses sometimes cluster tightly around a central courtyard or are built wall to wall, creating a solid outer face and an inner protected space. Storage pits and granaries may be inside living spaces, not out in the fields. Families put sleeping platforms above animals, above tools, above food. You don't just lie down where it's comfortable. You lie down where you can hear footsteps on the threshold. In some societies, unmarried young men sleep together in separate structures or at the edge of camp, specifically so they can respond fast to trouble. In others, older children are stationed near flocks at night. Oral histories from herding peoples are full of tales about boys waking to the bell of a panicked goat, or to the sudden silence of a flock that should be shuffling and snorting. All of this has a cost. Hypervigilance doesn't switch off just because you want a good night's rest. If you live in an environment where a rustle might be a hyena or a hostile cousin, your brain solves for survival, not for perfect sleep architecture. You probably fall asleep fast. The day is long and physical, but you don't stay deep for long stretches. Light sleep dominates. Micro-awakenings are common. Someone coughs, people stir. A log collapses in the fire. Eyes open, listen, close again. Mothers especially show this pattern in modern studies, even in safe houses. Amplify that in a world with real predators and fewer walls. Anthropologists observing present-day foragers often notice what looks like a natural watch system without anyone issuing orders. People don't all fall asleep and wake up at the same time. Chronotype variation, early birds, night owls, and everything between, turns out to be a feature, not a bug. In some groups, at any point in the night, there's almost always at least one person awake, poking the coals, humming, getting up to urinate, checking on a child. Elders with lighter sleep, nursing parents, restless adolescents, all cover different slices of the dark almost automatically. In more organized settings like war camps or volatile frontiers, this becomes explicit. Rotating watches, sentries assigned to time blocks, people whose job is to stay on that thin line between awake and asleep. The result is a compromise. No one gets uninterrupted, laboratory perfect sleep, but the group as a whole maintains a continuous low-level awareness. Night, for your ancestors, isn't a clean 8-hour blackout. It's a negotiated truce between exhaustion and exposure, held together by fire, dogs, walls, ears, and the strange human ability to hover half in dreams and half in the world whenever we're afraid. And that twitchy, broken pattern matters, because it sets the stage for something else our ancestors probably did that we mostly don't anymore, treating the night not as one long block of oblivion, but as something segmented, with its own built-in intermission. Imagine that truce between exhaustion and exposure holds for a while. You crash after the fire stories. Your brain, loaded with a day of walking, hauling, worrying and digesting, dives fast into deep sleep. The first couple of sleep cycles are the heaviest. That's true in modern lab studies, and it was true under the stars. Then, a few hours later, you surface. Not all the way awake, not fully dreaming, just up. For most of us inside electrified cities, that middle-of-the-night wake-up feels like a problem to be fixed. We grab a phone, stew about work, Google insomnia, and try to knock ourselves back out. But for a lot of human history, there's good evidence that this in-between state was not just normal. It was a recognized part of the night. Medieval European texts talk explicitly about first sleep and second sleep. People go to bed after supper, wake after their first sleep, pray, talk, sometimes even visit neighbours, then return for another bout of rest before dawn. In some early modern medical advice, doctors tell patients when to take remedies upon waking from the first sleep. Nobody pauses to explain what that means, which suggests it didn't need explaining. Even outside Europe, you get hints of something similar. Missionaries and colonial officials writing, sometimes condescendingly, about rural communities in Africa or the Americas mention people lying quiet for some hours, then rising to speak softly, pray, or smoke before sleeping again. In a few ethnographic accounts of foragers, the night is described as coming in waves, an intense early sleep, a calm, then a lighter dawn sleep when the birds start. What would drive this pattern? Start with geometry, the geometry of darkness. In temperate zones before electric lighting, winter nights can stretch 14 or 15 hours. Your body doesn't actually want to stay unconscious for that entire time. Adult humans seem to cap out around 7 to 9 hours of total sleep under most conditions. If sunset is at 4:30 p.m. and dawn is at 7:30 a.m., something has to fill the gap. One way nature solves that is by splitting the night into 2 chunks of sleep with a valley of wakefulness in between. Light levels matter too. Without bright artificial light in the evening, your internal clock gets a strong night has started signal soon after dusk. Melatonin rises earlier. You feel sleepy earlier. You may drift off not long after dark, bank a solid 4 hours then. As that first wave of deep sleep finishes and your core body temperature begins to climb again, you naturally rise toward wakefulness right in the middle of the night. Layer on social patterns. If the group is intentionally staggering vigilance, it actually helps if some people are semi-awake in that deep night window. Waking lightly, poking the fire, whispering with whoever else is up, that's both security and companionship. In households crammed into one dark room, one person stirring is a kind of alarm clock for others in that same biological phase. Then there are the babies. Human infants are biologically set to feed around the clock. Nursing at night suppresses ovulation in the mother, an ancient form of birth spacing, and babies who feed often tend to gain weight faster and survive better. A mother whose sleep is naturally in 2 segments, with a wakeful jog in the middle, might find it easier to manage long, unhurried feeds then, when she isn't fighting to stay awake after just falling asleep or dragging herself up at dawn. So what happens in that midnight intermission? Historical sources are surprisingly matter of fact. People pray. A lot of Christian devotional manuals from the late Middle Ages assume you'll recite specific psalms between sleeps in some monastic rules. This gets formalized into official night offices. In domestic settings, it's less organized but probably similar. Murmured prayers, quiet reflection, maybe a quick trip outside to relieve yourself and check the sky. Other activities are less pious. Court records and moralist grumblings talk about neighbours slipping out to visit each other after first sleep. It's dark, most people are down, but the few who are up move in a liminal space that's private without being fully secret. Couples use this time for sex. Several early modern writers explicitly say the interval after first sleep is best for the begetting of children. Body relaxed, digestion done, mind clear. There's also just conversation. If you're sharing a platform with family or lying head to foot with a line of cousins, the middle of the night can become a strange, intimate talk time. Whispers about dreams you just had, planning the next day. Stories that wouldn't fit in the noisy, task-filled hours of daylight. A kind of second, quieter evening. None of this means all humans, everywhere, always slept in neat, labelled segments. The evidence is patchy and culture-specific. Tropical populations near the equator don't get those extra long winter nights. Their day length is more stable, which may shift the calculus. Groups under intense predation or conflict pressure might prioritize constant dozing and watch rotation over any tidy first-second pattern. Hard agricultural harvest seasons, long hunts or military campaigns could override the body's preference with sheer exhaustion. You collapse and stay down as long as the universe lets you. Even within the same region and era, class and housing matter. Wealthy households with multiple rooms, servants, and more secure walls might treat the middle night wake as peaceful solitude or prayer time. Poorer families crammed into one smoky space with animals, and crying children might experience something more chaotic and less romantic. So why doesn't segmented sleep feel normal to most of us now? Artificial light mainly, and the schedules built on top of it. Once you can flood your home with bright light after sunset, your internal night gets pushed later. You keep brain and eyes stimulated with lamps, then gaslight, then bulbs and screens. Melatonin gets delayed. You don't fall asleep when it gets dark. You fall asleep when you finally force yourself to stop. That narrows the window for sleep into something that often lines up more closely with the 7-8 hours your body wants anyway. Add fixed work and school times, and there's strong pressure to make sleep one solid, efficient block. If the alarm is going off at 6:30 a.m., no matter what, a 2-hour contemplative wakeful spell at 2 a.m. becomes a liability, not a bonus. People who do naturally wake in the middle of the night now interpret it as insomnia instead of as an opportunity, which adds stress and makes it harder to drift back down. Yet when researchers put modern humans in environments closer to our ancestral ones, no artificial evening light, long dark periods, no alarm clocks, a lot of them start to drift toward exactly this segmented pattern. Early sleep, middle night calm, second sleep toward dawn. So when you imagine ancient humans and their nights, don't picture a single unbroken blackout. Picture the night as a landscape with its own topography, deep valleys of first sleep, a plateau of quiet wakefulness where people prayed, whispered, made love, and listened to the dark, and then a second gentle descent into dreams before the first birds and the first embers of dawn pulled them back to the work of the day. And in that in-between terrain lies something else our ancestors paid close attention to, because when you break the night in half, you also make more room to notice and talk about what happens in your dreams. You wake from that first sleep with a dream still clinging to you like cobweb. Today, if that dream is weird enough, you might type it into a search bar, scroll through a dream dictionary site, and half-jokingly tell a friend, apparently my teeth falling out means I'm stressed. For most of human history, that moment was not a joke. It was serious information. In a world where almost everything that mattered was invisible, germs, weather systems, other people's intentions, dreams were one of the few reliable sources of extra data. The night felt like a time when the universe loosened its grip a little and let signals leak through. In a lot of shamanic and small-scale societies that anthropologists have actually documented, dreams are not private psychological quirks. They're messages, your dead grandmother telling you to stop neglecting an offering, a forest spirit warning you about an area you shouldn't hunt tomorrow, an animal appearing again and again, not as cute symbolism, but as an ally or a claim. You are now the man of that jaguar or that owl is your guide. Even among early agricultural civilizations, where we have written evidence, you see the same logic. Ancient Mesopotamians had entire manuals for dream interpretation. Lists of, if you dream X, it means Y, treated almost like technical handbooks. In pharaonic Egypt, some officials brag in their tomb inscriptions that the god visited them in a dream to endorse a decision. Classical Greeks and Romans send questions to gods by sleeping in sanctuaries and waiting for answers in their dreams. So when you wake up in that middle of the night interval between first and second sleep, you're not just lying there idly replaying images. You're doing a kind of cognitive triage. Was that dream just random leftovers from the day? Or did something in it feel sharp, charged, like it came from outside? And you're not doing that alone. Morning in many traditional communities often starts with dream talk. Ethnographers living with foragers or small farmers report that breakfast time can double as debrief. Who dreamt what, and what it might mean for the day's plans. A hunter says he dreamed of a particular valley and a herd of animals moving through the reeds. Maybe that nudges the group's choice of where to walk. A mother tells of a disturbing dream about one child. People keep a closer eye on that kid near the river. Someone dreams of a dead relative asking for a specific ritual. The group sets aside time to perform it. This isn't mysticism as a side hobby, it's part of decision-making. And because you know your dreams will be heard and weighed by others, the way you experience them changes. You pay more attention. You rehearse them in your mind so you can report them accurately. You might even censor or shape them a bit, emphasizing what feels meaningful, glossing over the awkward or embarrassing parts. Over time, that can create a feedback loop where certain kinds of dream content get highlighted and remembered, and others quietly fade. Of course, if dreams can guide you, they can also scare you. Night was already loaded with risk. Predators in the dark, human enemies using the cover of night, spirits and ancestors whose moods you couldn't easily predict. Many cultures develop a thick layer of nighttime taboos and protective rituals woven right into the act of sleeping. Don't sleep with your head pointed a certain direction. Don't go outside alone between particular hours. Don't speak the names of certain beings after dark. Don't whistle. Don't yawn without covering your mouth. Don't leave a sleeping child's hair unbound. Each rule has a story behind it, someone who broke it and suffered. But the net effect is the same. The night becomes structured by invisible tripwires. Protection stacks on top of prohibition. People mark thresholds with ashes or special herbs. They tuck amulets into bedding. They murmur short formulas before lying down, invoking saints, spirits, or ancestors to keep watch while the household is helpless. A parent might gently pass a hand over a child's face with a set phrase so bad dreams slide off. In some places, a coal from the evening fire or a blade under the pallet acts as a general purpose night shield. These behaviors aren't just superstition, they're anxiety management tools. If you believe that saying a prayer, tracing a sign, or sleeping under a certain charm creates a bubble of safety, your brain is less likely to spiral into full-blown fear at every snap of a twig. Your physiological arousal drops. You fall asleep faster, you wake less often, and when you do wake, you have a ready explanation. I heard something, but the charm is there, instead of a free-floating sense of doom. Belief changes sleep. Modern studies show something similar. People who think their sleep was good report better mood and performance, even when their actual measured sleep was mediocre. In the past, if you thought your sleep was protected, blessed, or overseen by helpful powers, that conviction probably smoothed the psychological landscape of the night. And it didn't stop at passively receiving dreams. In many ancient cultures, people actively went looking for them. Dream incubation, trying to provoke a specific, meaningful dream, shows up surprisingly often once you know to look for it. In classical Greece, if you were sick or desperate for guidance, you might travel to an Asclepion, a healing shrine. You'd purify yourself, offer sacrifices, sleep in a designated space, and hope the god Asclepios would visit you in a dream with instructions. Similar practices pop up in ancient Near Eastern temples, early Christian monasteries, and Sufi traditions. Ritualized washing, special prayers, sleeping in a holy place, sometimes on an animal skin or near a relic, all with the explicit aim of getting a dream that solves a problem. Scale that idea down and you get more everyday forms of incubation. A hunter might go to sleep, holding a particular charm, hoping to dream of where game is. A young woman on the edge of marriage might perform a small ritual before bed, to dream of her future husband. A parent might sleep near a sick child after asking ancestors to show what must be done in a dream. Notice what this does to the shape of the night. If you go to bed expecting a message, the whole first half of the night becomes a kind of waiting room. When you wake after first sleep, you immediately check, did it happen? Did I dream anything usable? If yes, maybe you quietly thank the spirit, rehearse the dream so you don't forget, or even perform a short acknowledgement ritual before going back down. If not, you might use that middle period to repeat your request, adjust your position, or renew whatever vow you made. The night turns into a negotiation, and always in the morning, back around the fire or the kitchen hearth, it turns into a conversation. Sharing dreams isn't just about prediction. It's a subtle way for groups to process fears and desires without naming them directly. A child who can't quite say, "I'm scared of the dark," can say, "I dreamed a monster was watching me," and adults can respond with comfort, stories, or extra protection. An adult under social pressure might receive a dream from an ancestor that just happens to support what they wanted to do anyway. Leaders, healers, and shamans can weave individual dreams into a collective story about who the group is and where it's going. Dream gossip is also just bonding, laughing at each other's absurd night adventures, arguing over omens, comparing recurring themes. That's a low-stakes way of learning how other people think. You reveal which animals you fear, which relatives you miss, which temptations you battle, all in this deniable space of "it was only a dream." So when we ask, what did ancient humans do all day for sleep? Part of the answer is, they spent daylight hours building the mental and ritual scaffolding that would hold them through the dark, telling stories that made sense of nightmares, teaching children which dreams mattered, crafting the charms and prayers they'd rely on at night, watching the sky and the seasons so that when a dream seemed to line up with an omen in the world, they knew how seriously to take it. Night wasn't just a physiological dip in consciousness. It was a scheduled meeting with a world of meaning. And of course, not all of those meetings were peaceful, because alongside dreams came things that dragged people out of sleep for much rougher reasons: itching, biting, fevers, and pain. The unglamorous side of ancient nights that we'll rarely see in romantic cave paintings, but that probably defined a huge chunk of what trying to sleep actually felt like. If you strip away the charms and the stories, a lot of ancient nights were just uncomfortable. Start with the tiny things. If you're sleeping on organic materials, grass, leaves, wool, furs, straw, and you live in tight proximity to animals, you're basically running a 5-star hotel for parasites. Fleas, lice, mites, bed bugs long before bed was a wooden frame with a mattress. We know from mummies, from preserved hair, from fossilized poop, that human bodies have carried these hitchhikers for tens of thousands of years. Head lice combs show up in ancient Egyptian graves. Medieval documents complain about night tormentors and invisible biters. Even in 20th century ethnographies of foragers and villagers, picking lice is just part of social life. And parasites don't respect your sleep cycle. They're often most active at night, when you're still and easy to feed on. That means the moment your nervous system tries to downshift into deep, slow-wave sleep, something is crawling along your scalp or ankle or waistband, and your body does what it evolved to do: scratch, twitch, wake up enough to move. Imagine that scaled up to a whole household. One child starts fussing and scratching. They roll over, bump a sibling. Someone mutters, slaps an arm, sits up. Your natural night becomes a series of micro-arousals. Not dramatic awakenings, just constant shallow disruptions that keep you hovering in lighter stages of sleep. Humans weren't passive about this. They fought back with the tools they had. Smoke was a big one. If you're already keeping a fire going at night for warmth and protection, letting it smoulder, that same smoke helps repel insects. Many traditional societies deliberately burn specific woods or herbs in sleeping spaces: resins, aromatic leaves, dung that smokes slowly. It's not just ritual, it's low-tech pest control, unpleasant for lungs, but better than being eaten alive. Herbs and plant extracts show up too. People rub strong-smelling plants on skin and hair, hang bundles over sleeping areas, line mats with leaves that repel or kill bugs. Ashes from the hearth get dusted into hair or onto bedding to dry out lice and their eggs. Sand or fine soil sprinkled on the floor can make life harder for crawling insects. And then there's grooming. If you picture grooming as a once-a-day quick comb, scale it up. In many small-scale societies, delousing one another is a full-time background activity. People sit in the shade, pick through hair, crush lice between fingernails, chat. Parents inspect children at night. Couples check each other's bodies. It's hygiene, but it's also affection, gossip, alliance maintenance, and a nightly attempt to improve everyone's odds of uninterrupted sleep. Even with all that, bodies in the past carried a much heavier burden of infection than most of us do now, that has its own nighttime signature: chronic parasites in the gut, infected wounds, respiratory diseases, malaria, tuberculosis, leprosy. The list is long in archaeological bones and historical records. When your immune system is constantly engaged, it releases inflammatory molecules that change sleep architecture. Modern medicine can measure this. Inflammation tends to make you drowsier at odd times, but it also fragments deep sleep and can trigger night sweats, fever dreams, restless tossing. Picture trying to sleep through a malaria fever without quinine, or a chest infection without antibiotics. You swing between shivering and burning up. You soak your bedding. You doze, then jolt awake in a puddle of sweat or with a racking cough. That's not the serene, aligned with nature sleep we like to project backward. Then layer on pain. Teeth, for instance. Ancient skulls, hunter-gatherers and farmers alike, very often show cavities, abscesses, and heavy wear. Early farmers, eating more sticky starches and grinding stone dust into their flour, seem to have had especially bad teeth. Without dentists, a rotting molar isn't a 2-week inconvenience. It's a multi-year source of throbbing, radiating pain that gets worse when you lie down and blood flow to the head increases. You can chew on analgesic bark, pack herbs into the cavity, press a warm cloth to your face. But many nights will still end with you staring into the dark, counting your heartbeat in each stab of pain, while everyone else around you tries to sleep. Injuries tell a similar story. Fractured bones, torn ligaments, infected cuts from stone tools or animal bites, all of which we see plenty of evidence for, don't magically quiet down at bedtime. If anything, they hurt more when you're immobile. People in the past absolutely used splints, poultices, bone setting, even crude surgeries. They also used alcohol and plant drugs to blunt pain. But an untreated infection in a joint, or ribs bruised from a fall, can wake you every time you roll over. So when someone today says, people slept better before modern life messed everything up, it depends what you mean by better. Yes, ancient nights were darker. Yes, days were more physically active, and circadian rhythms were likely more tightly synced to the sun. But the same natural world also meant more parasites, more infections, more untreated injuries, more chronic pain, higher child mortality, and far less control over any of it. For a lucky, healthy subset of people in good conditions that might have produced long, deep, satisfying sleep. For many others, nights were a mix of fear, itching, coughing, and hurting, stitched together with whatever rituals and remedies could take the edge off. And that's important context when we look at what people actually did with their days. Because a lot of doing things for sleep in the past wasn't optimizing in our modern sense. It was just fighting back, cleaning bedding in the river, picking lice from a child's hair, brewing bitter infusions, tending a wound, all small acts aimed at carving out a few hours of bearable rest in a body that was constantly under siege. On top of that, the world itself refused to cooperate. Seasons swung, storms blew in, winters stretched the nights to absurd lengths, and summers sliced them thin. The next layer of the story is how weather and the turning of the year kept reshaping what a normal night's sleep could even mean. If you live by the sky instead of by a clock, the year doesn't just change the temperature. It stretches and compresses time itself. Start with winter. In temperate and high-latitude regions, winter nights can swallow half, even 2/3 of the day. If your main light is fire and your main heat is body warmth, that changes everything about how you sleep. Cold pushes people inward and together. Archaeology gives us dense winter layers in caves and rock shelters. More ash, more bone fragments, more trash built up in a smaller space. Ethnography shows the same pattern, larger groups clustering in better insulated winter quarters, smaller satellite camps abandoned until spring. More bodies in a confined space means more shared warmth. You pile furs, skins, woven mats. You sleep closer, sometimes with animals inside or right up against the walls. In the coldest places, your breath and the fire's moisture frost the ceiling by morning. You don't have central heating, you have thermal strategy. And with 15-16 hours of darkness outside, you're not necessarily sleeping the whole time. Long winters are where segmented sleep becomes especially plausible. An early first sleep, a wakeful middle of the night to stir the coals, talk quietly, have sex, nurse babies, check on the animals, then a second sleep toward dawn. You might not conceptualize it as two sleeps. It's just what the long night naturally allows. Contrast that with summer. In many places, summer dawn comes obscenely early. If daylight is the cue for we should be doing things, you're getting up with that first grey light, not 7:30 sharp because your phone says so. Work that depends on cool air. Walking, hunting, weeding fields, hauling water shifts toward early morning and late afternoon. The hottest hours push people into shade and stillness. Midday rest, which in winter might be a luxury, becomes a survival pattern. You stop moving, lie in the shadow of a tree, crawl under a shelter, doze lightly. It's not always a formal siesta, but the logic is the same. Avoid burning calories and water when the sun is at maximum. Short nights and long, exhausting days can fragment sleep in the opposite way to winter. You might get a shorter core sleep anchored to the brief darkness, plus small naps stolen whenever the work rhythm allows. In hot, relatively safe climates, people sometimes move their main sleep outdoors in summer, on roofs, in courtyards, on raised platforms under the stars. Cooler air, but more exposure to insects, neighbours' noise, and whatever passes for nightlife in your village. Then add rain. In many parts of the world, the real divider isn't just hot versus cold, it's dry versus wet. A monsoon or long rainy season means weeks of damp air, dripping roofs, and ground that never fully dries. Organic bedding soaks this up. Straw, leaves, wool, even leather can hold moisture and start to rot. Mould isn't just modern apartment drama, it's a constant in any humid enclosed space. Mould spores and damp air irritate lungs, worsen coughs, and make every breath in a smoky hut feel heavier. You might huddle tighter to stay warm in the damp, but the closer you pack, the more you share every cough and every fungal bloom. People fight back with what they have, raising sleeping surfaces off the ground, drying mats in rare bursts of sun, rotating bedding so one layer can air out while another is used. But there is no dehumidifier. If the rainy season lasts months, you live and sleep in that saturated air. All of this plays out under a sky that doesn't just give you sun and clouds. It gives you the moon, Without electric lighting, the difference between a moonless and a full moon night is enormous. On dark, overcast nights, moving far from the fire is dangerous. You stay close, you listen, you accept that the world beyond the glow is basically invisible. Predators, cliffs, rivers, enemies, all harder to see. That pushes night activity down and indirectly pushes sleep up. On clear full moon nights, the world opens back up. You can see the path. You can travel, check traps, fish, visit another camp. Many traditional societies time night hunts or long walks to the brighter part of the lunar month. That means your bedtime isn't a fixed rule. It flexes with the moon and with cloud cover. Some months you sleep earlier and longer. Others you stretch the day into the night because you can. There's also the more slippery factor. How all this affects mood. We know today that light, especially morning light, helps set our circadian clock and influences things like seasonal depression. It would be strange if earlier humans living directly under those light cycles felt nothing at all. We can't interview a Neanderthal about their winter blues, but it's reasonable to think that weeks of grey sky, cramped indoor living, and long darkness might make some people quieter, more withdrawn, less energetic. In contrast, bright, long summer days could pull people into later nights of socializing and earlier, more enthusiastic starts, even if that meant accumulating sleep debt that got repaid in winter. What matters for our story is that what did they do all day for sleep wasn't a single pattern. It bent around the year. Cold drove people to insulate, cluster, and accept long, broken nights. Heat and long daylight drove early starts, midday retreats, and sometimes lighter, shorter night's sleep. Rain turned bedding into a maintenance problem. Moonlight flipped the risk-reward calculation of nighttime movement, and through it all, bodies and minds were constantly adjusting, even if nobody had a word for circadian rhythm or seasonal affective disorder. Next, we move into the first places where that natural fluidity starts to crash into something new. Walls, streets, crowds, and neighbours who don't all want to sleep and wake at the same time. The first real cities are where sleep stops being mostly a conversation between your body and the sky, and starts being a negotiation with everybody else. Hunter-gatherer camps flexed around seasons and moonlight. Early villages flexed around planting and harvest. But in places like Uruk, Mohenjo-Daro, Old Kingdom Memphis, classical Athens, early Han Chinese cities, something new appears on the archaeological and textual radar. People stack together so densely that someone is almost always awake, and that someone is very often in your way. Crowding is the most obvious shift. Instead of a handful of huts or a family compound, you now have multi-room houses sharing walls, upper stories leaning over narrow streets, workshops pressed up against sleeping areas. In some ancient Near Eastern cities, population density may have rivaled or exceeded modern Manhattan, just without insulation or double glazing. Thin mud brick walls don't block sound very well. You hear the loom next door, the clay jars being moved upstairs, the argument in the courtyard, the donkey tied under your window. Above you, footsteps, grinding, kids dropping things. Below you, if you're over a shop, customers coming and going, voices haggling, the clatter of closing up at night and opening again at dawn. If earlier, rural sleep was shaped by the roar of wind or the howl of a predator, urban sleep is shaped by the ongoing murmur of other humans. It's not absolute noise all the time. Nights could still be very quiet by our standards, but silence is no longer the default. Your sleep has to happen in a soundscape you don't control. Then add smell. Smoke from thousands of cooking fires, tanneries, latrines, animals kept inside city walls. None of this is noise in the acoustic sense, but physiologically it keeps your body slightly on alert, coughing, shifting, waking more often. For many urban poor, sleep disturbance probably wasn't a rare problem. It was baked into the architecture. Artificial light intensifies this shift. For most of human history, if you wanted to push the day past sunset, you needed fire. In cities, that meant oil lamps, candles, resin torches, things that cost money. In a wealthy household, many rooms might be lit at once. The main hall glowing for an evening meal, servants moving through with lamps, someone reading a scroll or tablet, someone else doing needlework. If you're rich, you can literally buy extra hours of waking life. That usually means you can also choose when to go to bed, rather than collapsing as soon as it gets dark. If you're poor, your fuel budget is tiny, maybe one lamp, maybe none. You might stretch the evening with a small flame in a common courtyard, then go inside a pitch-dark room where you know every crack by touch. Ironically, the people whose days are most controlled by urban schedules and bosses are also the ones who can least afford to light their nights. Still, any lamp at all changes behaviour. A single light in a shop lets you keep it open after sunset. A line of lamps along a main street turns a once dangerous night path into a semi-safe corridor. In some Roman and Near Eastern cities, inscriptions and legal texts hint at streets lit for festivals or near markets. That visible, walkable night is the seedbed of something new, night work. Once you have enough people in one place, it becomes economical to have activities that deliberately ignore sunset. Night markets appear. In hotter climates, they're almost inevitable, buying and selling in cooler air, when farmers have finished day labour and can come in from the countryside. Food stalls, small goods, maybe music, maybe gambling. If your trade depends on serving those crowds, cooks, porters, vendors, you're working when others are trying to sleep. Guards are another obvious group. City walls, gates, palaces, warehouses, somebody has to watch them. Babylonian records, Roman military manuals, and later medieval urban ordinances all talk about watch rotations, curfews, gate closings. That means at least some people in every city living on a rotating or permanently shifted schedule. They sleep partially by day or in fragmented chunks between watches. Shift work disorder didn't have a name, but the pattern already existed. Then you get specialized crafts that run through the night because heat or timing demands it. Bakers firing ovens before dawn so bread is ready at first light. Metalworkers keeping furnaces running. Laundries and fullers working odd hours so they don't clash with daytime traffic. Legal codes sometimes mention noisy trades restricted to certain districts or times, which is basically ancient noise complaint law. If those restrictions existed, it's because people's sleep was already being wrecked by work happening at the wrong hours. All of this hits different social classes in very different ways. At the top, elites often live in larger compounds or houses with internal courtyards. Privacy isn't modern apartment privacy. There are servants, dependents, extended kin, but you might at least have a designated sleeping room, thicker walls, doors that close. Bedding is higher quality, wool or cotton mattresses, multiple layers of textiles, sometimes raised wooden beds, with proper frames. Your sleep might still be fragmented by politics, anxiety, and late-night drinking, but physically you can carve out quieter, softer space. In the middle, small property owners and artisans squeeze work and sleep into the same cube of air. A workshop on the ground floor, sleeping loft above. Tools, goods, and family members all sharing space. Kids, apprentices, sick relatives. You might have a pallet or shared bed. Not much noise insulation, and a constant risk of someone's livelihood forcing odd hours right underneath you. Urban insomniacs probably clustered in this band. Not the poorest, but the ones trying hardest to balance work, status, and limited space. At the bottom, things get harsh. Textual hints and later historical analogies point toward overcrowded rentals, shared rooms, and people sleeping wherever there was floor. In some ancient port cities and slums, that meant dozens of strangers in the same building. Thin partitions, if any, sex work, drinking, and fights mixing into the overnight soundtrack. If you're enslaved or a low-status labourer, you might sleep in a storage room, hallway, stable, or on a roof exposed to weather and street noise. Your bed might be a blanket on hard ground, or nothing. The inequality isn't just about comfort, it's about control. Rich households can decide when lamps go out, when guests leave, and who's allowed to make noise. Poor neighbours often can't. A baby crying through the night, someone coming home drunk, an early morning cart rumbling over stone if you share walls. You inherit other people's schedules, whether you want them or not. The result is that city life doesn't just shift sleep later or earlier, it explodes sleep into a mosaic of patterns. Some people go to bed at dusk because they're exhausted and can't afford light. Others stay awake deep into the night because they're on watch, at a market, in a workshop, or at a banquet. Some wake before dawn to bake, others only crawl into bed once the ovens are already hot. Seasonal changes and moon phases still matter, but now they're layered under street plans, curfews, shop hours, and the preferences of the powerful. For the first time in human history, your chronotype, whether you naturally skew early bird or night owl, starts colliding with an external, human-made timetable. And right on cue, another invention appears that will tighten that timetable even further: systematic timekeeping and the social rules that come with it. Once you start trying to coordinate more than a neighbourhood's worth of people, the sun is up, stops being precise enough. You need finer slices of time, and once you have those slices, you can start telling people exactly when they're supposed to be awake. The first clocks weren't gears and bells, they were shadows and drips. Long before mechanical clocks, people watched how a shadow moved on a wall or courtyard floor. Obelisks, standing stones, sundials. They're all ways of turning the smooth curve of the day into marked segments. Not whenever it seems right, but when the shadow reaches this line. The problem is, shadows disappear at night and on cloudy days. So by the 2nd millennium BCE in Egypt and Mesopotamia, you get water clocks, controlled drips filling or emptying a vessel, marked on the inside to show roughly how much time has passed. The accuracy is nothing like a digital watch, but it's good enough to say, this ritual starts at third water, or the night watch changes when the bowl is half empty. This is where sleep starts getting pulled onto a schedule. If you're a temple priest in Thebes, or a night watchman in Babylon, you're no longer just up sometime in the middle of the night. You're up when the water level hits the mark. Your wakefulness is now tied to a device, not to your own sleepiness. Miss your turn, and you're not just late. You're guilty of neglecting the gods or endangering the city. Religion takes this new precision and runs with it. Many ancient societies had always had dawn rituals, offerings at sunrise, first prayers with first light. But as timekeeping improves, those rituals harden into fixed obligations. In some Mesopotamian temples, priests had to perform offerings at specific points in a 24-part day. In Egypt, hymns and incense offerings were coordinated with solar movement almost like a liturgical timetable. Later, in Jewish, Christian, and Islamic traditions, this becomes even clearer. The Shema, at specific times, monastic hours of prayer, spaced through day and night, the Muslim calls to prayer anchored to solar positions, but regulated with increasingly accurate timekeeping. If the muezzin is calling at dawn, you're getting up at dawn, not whenever you feel rested. If the monastery's bell rings at midnight for vigils, someone has to roll out of bed at midnight. In monasteries especially, sleep becomes a managed resource. Early Benedictine rules in Europe, for example, divide the 24 hours into chunks of prayer, work, reading, meals, and sleep. Night is punctured by scheduled services. In summer, when days are long, monks might sleep less. In winter, they're allowed more. But it's all written down, counted, and supervised. Dozing off during the night office isn't just being tired, it's a breach of discipline. Armies do something similar for more practical reasons. Once you have organised watches, you need a reliable way to know when to change them. Roman camps used water clocks and hour calls. Chinese and Islamic militaries developed drum or bell signals to mark divisions of the night. Being a soldier now often means sleeping in shifts dictated by the watch schedule, not by your own internal clock. Chronic partial sleep deprivation isn't a modern military invention. It's built into any system that makes men stay alert in rotation. Cities latch onto time discipline too, through rules that sound mundane but carve up the night very effectively. Gate closing times are one example. Many walled cities shut their gates at sunset or at a specified hour of the night that instantly creates a social deadline. If you're outside, you either hurry in before the gate shuts or plan to sleep wherever you are. If you're inside, late arrivals stop banging on doors once it's understood that the city is officially closed. Curfews are even more direct. Medieval and early modern towns issue ordinances saying when fires must be covered, when taverns have to close, when people must be off the streets unless they're guards or on special business. There are practical reasons, fire prevention, crime control, but the side effect is that collective bedtime becomes a legal topic. Your evening doesn't end when you're tired. It ends when the bell rings and the authorities say it does. Workshops and guilds contribute their own layer. Artisan regulations from the classical and medieval worlds sometimes specify opening and closing times, or at least expected hours of labour. If the shop opens at first bell and closes at second or at sunset, that tells everyone when they should be up, at their tools, and when they can finally rest. In some mining, milling, or textile operations, where water flow or furnace heat sets the pace, shifts become structured around external cycles plus human-made time cues. You might go to bed knowing that in 6 hours, 6 marks on a water clock, 6 sandglass turns, you'll be shaken awake to take someone's place. Over centuries, all these small constraints start to reshape how people think about sleep itself. In a purely foraging world, being a night owl or an early bird is just variation. Groups flex to accommodate different alertness peaks. In a tightly scheduled city, monastery or army, those differences are moralized. The person who keeps sleeping after the morning bell is lazy, not just biologically late phase. The worker who falls asleep before curfew is weak, not just a short sleeper. Normal sleep shifts from what your body does under the sky to what respectable people are expected to do within this time grid. Religious texts praise early rising and warn against slumbering in bed. Civic regulations assume that good citizens will be quiet at certain hours and visible at others. Medical writers begin to talk about proper times, to sleep and wake, framed around humoral balance and the rhythm of meals and work. None of this changes your basic circadian machinery. But it does change how acceptable it is to listen to it. By the time mechanical clocks and hourly bells spread across Europe, China, and the Islamic world, the groundwork is already laid. People have spent millennia learning to obey shadows, drips, bells, and gongs. Culture has been quietly training bodies to sleep when the schedule says so, not necessarily when the brain is ready. And once you can move those schedules with stimulants and sedatives, with herbs, alcohol, and eventually caffeine, you get an even stronger push away from purely natural sleep and towards something more like performance. Once you start telling people exactly when to be awake, the next question is obvious. What if your body doesn't cooperate? This is where substances creep into the story. Not espresso shots or canned energy drinks. Those are very recent, but older tools humans found to push the brain in one direction or another. Stay alert when you're supposed to be on watch. Calm down when your mind won't settle after a day of fear and work. Endure pain without screaming through the night. And the key thing is, this never happened all at once, and it never happened everywhere. There is no single ancient human drug kit. There are dozens of regional experiments. Start with stimulants. Coffee as we know it, roasted beans from Coffea arabica brewed into a dark drink, doesn't show up until the last millennium in Ethiopia and the Arabian Peninsula. Tea, Camellia sinensis, steeped in hot water, has its roots in ancient China, but the evidence for everyday use as a wake-up drink is later than people like to imagine. But those aren't the only ways to poke the nervous system. Long before coffee houses, groups all over the world were chewing, smoking, or brewing local plants that nudged them toward alertness. In the Andes, coca leaves have been used for thousands of years, a mild stimulant when chewed with alkaline ash, easing fatigue, hunger, and altitude stress. In parts of East Africa and the Arabian Peninsula, hat leaves were chewed for a light, talkative buzz. In North America, many indigenous groups used tobacco not just as a ritual sacred plant, but as a potent stimulant and appetite suppressant, especially when nicotine levels were high and ingestion was frequent. These weren't usually morning lattes. They were woven into work and ritual. A hunter chewing something bitter and energizing as he walks into a long, cold night. A messenger covering huge distances with the help of a plant that blunts exhaustion. A group of men staying up to guard herds, talking, smoking, keeping one another from drifting off. From a sleep perspective, this does two things. First, it lets people override natural sleepiness when social obligations demand wakefulness, night watches, long raids, all-night ceremonies. Second, it starts to disconnect the feeling of being awake from the actual state of being rested. You can be wired and exhausted at the same time. That's not purely modern. The same pattern shows up with nicotine. In societies where tobacco becomes common, you start seeing small, frequent doses all day and into the night. Each one is a tiny nudge to the arousal system. The result is not necessarily dramatic insomnia, but a baseline that's a little more jittery, a little more fragmented. Falling asleep might be easy after a physically exhausting day, but staying asleep or returning to sleep after a midnight waking is more complicated when your nervous system is being tickled regularly. On the other side of the spectrum are fermented drinks. Wherever you can get sugars to sit around and let microbes do their work, alcohol appears. In the Near East, grains become beer. In the Mediterranean, grapes become wine. In China, rice ferments into various alcoholic brews. In northern climates, honey and fruits turn into mead and ciders. Archaeological evidence for intentional fermentation goes back at least to the Neolithic in several regions, and possibly earlier in some controversial sites. Alcohol is, at first glance, a sleep aid. It relaxes muscles, reduces anxiety, and makes social interaction feel easier. After a day of hard labour or danger, a communal drink is a fast track to feeling drowsy and content. For people living in cramped dwellings, with no sound insulation and a lot of background noise, getting even a slightly easier slide into sleep might have felt like a gift. But the brain doesn't read it as a gift, it reads it as a disruption. We know from modern research that alcohol shortens sleep latency. You fall asleep faster, but it fragments the second half of the night. Dream sleep gets disturbed. The autonomic nervous system becomes more unstable, and early morning awakenings are more common. There's no reason to think ancient brains reacted differently. A farmer knocking back several cups of thick, low-alcohol beer every evening probably feels like he's sleeping like a stone. In reality, his night is likely choppier, his dreams more disrupted, his early morning alertness dulled. Scale that up to whole communities and you get something interesting. Group habits that quietly rewrite what normal sleep feels like. If everyone in the village drinks in the evening as part of ritual or bonding, and everyone wakes up a bit foggy, nobody labels that as a drug effect. It's just the morning, the same way modern people normalize feeling half dead without coffee. Ancient drinkers normalize restless, early waking nights as part of human life. Alcohol also plays a double role in night fears. A small amount can make you less anxious about the dark and the noises outside the shelter. A larger amount delays your response time if those noises actually are something dangerous. So societies had to strike a balance, often enforced through custom, when it's acceptable to drink heavily, when it's reserved for festivals, when it's off limits for guards or people on watch. Sedatives and painkillers push the story in yet another direction. Humans have been experimenting with calming and numbing plants for an extremely long time. Poppies in the Old World, various nightshades and henbane in Europe and the Near East, cannabis in parts of Asia, kava in the Pacific, valerian and other root infusions, barks rich in salicylates or other compounds. The list is long and region-specific. Sometimes these were ritual tools, a shaman or healer using smoke or drink to enter an altered state during a night ceremony, seeing visions, interpreting dreams. Sometimes they were practical medicine, easing childbirth, dulling toothache, helping someone sleep through a broken bone or a fever. For sleep they matter because they change who gets rest and on what terms. If you live in a world without synthetic painkillers, the difference between a night with untreated pain and a night under the influence of a plant sedative is enormous. One is hours of semi-conscious suffering. The other might be patchy, dream-filled, and physiologically strange, but at least you get some oblivion. That's still not natural sleep. It's chemically altered. But for many people, especially the sick or injured, it's probably the closest thing they had to relief. And again, patterns emerge. In some traditions, certain herbs are reserved for the powerful, for priests, for healers. In others, mild sedatives pass into household use. Teas to calm children, poultices that help you rest. As these practices spread, the baseline expectation of what night feels like shifts. Falling asleep without a calming draught starts to feel unusual, just as many modern people think of sleep without a glass of wine or a pill as difficult. The common thread through all of this is how uneven it is. Some hunter-gatherer groups likely went through most of their history, with almost no regular pharmacological alteration of sleep beyond incidental plant effects. Others, especially farming societies with reliable surpluses and fermentation technology, built whole social calendars around drinking. High-altitude peoples developed long-term relationships with coca or other stimulants. Island cultures refined plant sedatives tied to ritual and hospitality. There is no universal ancient coffee, no global ancient sleeping pill. There are only local hacks layered onto the same basic human brain. But once those hacks exist, they interact with time schedules in a powerful way. You're not just told to get up at second bell. You're also handed, or you seek out, something to make that bearable. You're not just told to be calm during a dangerous, noisy night. You learn which brew or smoke takes the edge off. Sleep stops being purely about light, dark, and tiredness. It becomes something you actively manage with substances, even if you don't have any biochemical theory for what they're doing. And that finally sets the stage for the last part of the story. If ancient people had all these constraints, substances and environmental pressures shaping their rest, what did an actual ordinary day look like for sleep? And what, if anything, from that world is still useful for us now? If you strip away the clocks, the pills, the caffeine, what's left is surprisingly simple. Most of what ancient humans did for sleep wasn't at night. It was baked into the entire day. Start with light. From the moment the sky began to brighten, their eyes were getting slammed with daylight levels most modern indoor workers never see. Not just a quick dash to the car and into an office, but hours outside, walking, gathering, digging, herding, fishing, trading. Even in forests under cloud cover, the light was orders of magnitude stronger than a living room lamp. That morning and midday light is like a daily message to the brain's clock. This is daytime. Lock this in. It anchors circadian rhythms, reinforces a clear contrast between day and night, and makes it easier for sleep pressure to build in a predictable way. You don't have to optimize your circadian biology if you live in an environment that does it for you. Movement layered right on top of that. Foragers walked. Farmers bent, lifted, carried, hoed, ground grain. Even craft specialists in early towns hauled water, fetched fuel, moved goods. You didn't go to the gym. The world was your gym whether you liked it or not. There were slow days, there were hungry, low-energy days, but across weeks and seasons, bodies were doing hours of low to moderate physical activity almost by default. That kind of sustained movement doesn't knock you out instantly, like an extreme workout might, but it raises baseline sleep drive. Muscles get micro-damaged, temperature cycles rise and fall, adenosine, one of the brain chemicals that tracks time awake, quietly accumulates. By dusk, the gap between tired and not tired was probably a lot clearer than it is for someone who sat indoors all day. Thermal cycles added another layer. Without central heating and air conditioning, daily temperature swings were obvious. Mornings could be cold, midday brutally hot, evenings cooling again. People responded with shade at noon, lighter work in the peak heat when possible, fires and extra coverings at night. That pattern, warm, active day, cooler, quieter night, lines up neatly with the body's own tendency to drop core temperature before and during sleep. You don't have to understand chronobiology for it to pull you toward earlier, deeper sleep. Then comes the evening, and here the big feature wasn't what they had, but what they didn't. There simply wasn't much light. Firelight is dim and orange-red. Even a huge bonfire is dwarfed in terms of brightness by a brightly lit modern kitchen. After sunset, the visual environment collapsed into a small bubble around flames. Outside that bubble, darkness, stars, and whatever your imagination put between them. That scarcity of evening light is its own sleep practice. Melatonin, the hormone that rises before sleep, isn't being slammed down by blue-white LEDs. Social activity still happens, but it happens in a sensory context that gently leans toward drowsiness. Voices, stories, tasks that can be done by touch. Fewer sharp, novel visual inputs. Social cues did the rest. In small bands or households, people didn't decide their schedule in isolation. If the group headed out at dawn, you headed out at dawn. If the compound gates were shut at night, you came back before they closed. Shared meals, shared work, shared rituals, all of them acted like social clock signals, telling individuals when it was time to be on and when it was acceptable to drift off. Food timing sat on top of this as a flexible modifier. Foraging groups often ate opportunistically. Snacks as things were found, a more focused prep and eating period toward late day if a hunt or big harvest was successful. Early farmers started to show more routine. Grain porridge or bread in the morning, heavier labour in the fields, main meals in the late afternoon or evening when work and light were fading. In both cases, huge, late-night meals were rare. firewood and effort were scarce. That means less heavy digestion in the deepest part of the night, less reflux, fewer metabolic jolts at midnight. Workload peaks mattered too. Harvest seasons, big hunts, long migrations, construction projects. These created stretches where people were pushed hard. Sleep got shorter. Nights were broken by watches or predators or weather. But these were typically episodic, not year-round. After the intense phase came slack periods when you could sleep longer, nap more, recover. Sleep wasn't always perfect, but it was elastic. Stress and safety were the wild cards. If you're in a region with lots of predators, rival groups or bandits, you don't just go lights out, everyone unconscious. Communities developed staggered wakefulness. Someone tending the fire, someone listening, dogs or other animals acting as alarms. Mothers of infants woke frequently. Older children and grandparents might sleep lighter or at the edge of the group. Total hours of sleep might still be substantial over 24 hours, but distributed differently. Some at night, some in dusk, dawn, dozing, occasional daytime naps. In crowded early cities, the pattern shifted again. Noise, smells, crime, and nighttime work made continuous, quiet sleep harder, even if people were still exposed to plenty of daylight. Here, communal rules, curfews, guard rotations, market hours, festival calendars started to script sleep more tightly, but the basics remained: bright days, darker nights, lots of walking, lots of heat and cold. So what's universal in all this? Bright natural light during the active part of the day. Regular physical movement, especially weight-bearing and walking. Exposure to natural temperature swings, evenings that are dimmer and simpler than the day. Social structures that keep individuals roughly aligned with one another. Food mostly clustered into daylight and early evening, not midnight. What varied widely were the details. How long midday rest lasted. How segmented night sleep was. How much safety people felt after dark. How often stimulants, alcohol or sedatives were used. How strongly leaders, priests or clocks dictated the schedule versus the sun and the season. Ancient humans weren't doing sleep hygiene. They were just living in a world where almost every default, light, movement, temperature, community, happened to nudge the brain's sleep systems in a particular direction. Which raises the real question for us. If we can't copy their lives, can we at least borrow their patterns? What might a modern day look like if we try to tilt it toward the kind of sleep their world made almost unavoidable? If you zoom out over everything we've talked about, a few big forces keep showing up. Light, labour, temperature, safety, other people. No matter whether you were a forager chasing seasonal berries, an early farmer pushing through harvest, or a craft worker in a noisy early city, those 5 things were the scaffolding your day was built on. They set the shape. Sleep just filled in the gaps they left. But it's important not to pretend there was one ancient routine everyone followed. A small coastal band in a tropical forest, a herding group on a cold steppe, and a family jammed into a multi-story house in a Bronze Age city did not live the same way. Some probably slept closer to 6-7 hours at night, plus frequent naps. Others may have had long winter nights with 9-10 hours in bed and a wakeful watch in the middle. Some went to bed not long after sunset. Others stayed up late into the night around fires, especially when big hunts, raids, or rituals were happening. So when you hear anyone say humans are meant to sleep exactly like X, that's already suspicious. The archaeological and historical record doesn't show one rigid pattern. It shows a range constrained by environment and technology. What does seem consistent is the direction of the pressures. Days were bright, and a lot of that brightness hit your eyes. Bodies did physical work that mounted over hours, not in a 30-minute burst. The air around you got hot and cold in noticeable ways. Nights were usually darker and simpler than days, even in dense towns. And you were rarely alone. Other people's expectations, needs, and fears pulled your schedule into alignment with theirs. If we try to boil that into something you can actually use, it's less copy the Paleolithic and more tilt your modern life in the same direction and see what happens. Think of these as experiments, not commandments. First, light. For 1 or 2 weeks, try getting at least 30-60 minutes of real outdoor light in the first half of the day. Not through a window, not under a tiny office lamp. Outside, or as close as you can get, balcony, sidewalk, backyard. Notice what happens to your evening tiredness and morning wake-ups. If you already do that, try dimming your world harder in the last hour before bed. Fewer screens, fewer overhead LEDs, more lamps and warm tones. Second, movement. You don't need to drag a mammoth, but you can steal the pattern, accumulate a lot of gentle motion. Walking, stairs, carrying groceries, household tasks you usually outsource. Spread it through the day. See if, over a week or two, your body starts offering you sleep more decisively at night instead of hovering in that vague, wired but tired zone. Third, temperature. Let your environment signal day and night a bit more. Slightly cooler bedroom, maybe a warm shower or bath an hour before bed, so your core temperature can drift down afterward. If you always live at one neutral indoor temperature, a small day-night contrast can act like a missing cue your ancestors took for granted. Fourth, social rhythm. If your schedule has dissolved into pure individual choice, borrow some structure. Shared meals at consistent times. A friend you walk with most mornings. A partner or roommate you agree to start winding down with at roughly the same hour. Our ancestors had their sleep pulled into line by the group. You can recreate a gentler version of that on purpose. Fifth, food timing. You don't have to eat like a Mesolithic forager, but you can nudge big, heavy meals earlier. More of your calories when the sun is up, fewer huge, late-night feasts when your body is trying to slide into repair mode. Again, treat it as a trial, 2 weeks. Then compare your sleep and how you feel in the morning. None of this will turn your apartment into a savannah camp. You still have alarms, work shifts, kids, neighbours, phones. But that's the point. Ancient humans didn't optimize their sleep in a vacuum. Their days were designed for them by the sun, the season, the landscape, and their community. If you rebuild even a little of that, brighter days, more movement, clearer temperature and light contrasts, a bit of shared structure, earlier eating, you're giving your brain some of the same signals their brains were bathed in for tens of thousands of years. So when we ask, what did ancient humans actually do all day for sleep? The answer is, they mostly lived in a way that made good enough sleep the default. The environment was the clock, the work was the exercise. The fire was the night mode. The group was the scheduler. Our world breaks a lot of those defaults, but it also gives us something they didn't have, the ability to choose, to notice what helps and deliberately put more of it back. If this video gave you some ideas you want to try in your own routine, tap like so more people can find it. Subscribe if you want more deep dives into how humans actually lived and what that means for us now. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and which of these ancient experiments you're thinking about testing in your modern day.